Saluto tutti gli ospiti, parto dagli studenti e dalle studentesse e vi saluto fin da subito. Saluto tutti i nostri ospiti di questo convegno, le persone che ci seguono da casa e do subito la parola al nostro direttore di dipartimento, Marco Segala, che farà un piccolo saluto da parte della nostra istituzione.
Grazie Laura, anch'io vi do il benvenuto, è un grande piacere ospitare oggi questo convegno all'interno del PRIN coordinato da Laura qui, con la collaborazione anche della Fondazione Patrum Lumen Sustine di Basilea, bisogna ricordarlo. Laura mi ha un po' raccontato, mi ha un po' scritto il senso e l'ampiezza di questo convegno e sono molto lieto che oggi e domani siano qui raccolte studiose e studiosi per parlare di temi che una volta venivano ritenuti soltanto sicuramente molto polverosi e probabilmente anche molto noiosi da chi non se ne occupava, ma parlarne con una modalità, con approcci multidisciplinari che secondo me sono importantissimi, sia proprio per approfondire le conoscenze, per capire di più, perché questo poi è lo scopo di tutto quanto, ma anche per costruire reti di relazioni, costruire rapporti nuovi che permettano a chi coltiva le humanities di essere in relazione con gli sviluppi della tecnologia e con discipline sempre delle humanities di altro settore, diciamo così. La settorialità purtroppo è un tema terribile nell'Accademia italiana, in nessun altro paese ci sono i settori, al limite ci sono le sezioni tipo Kuhn, ma che andrebbero anche bene, ma vabbè, non mi dilungo. Quindi questo approccio, questo vedere questo tema così classico, così noto, così antico, rivederlo sotto una luce tanto nuova e secondo me è proprio luce, è illuminante, sì, visto che è una luce, è illuminante, scusate, una banalità. E sono davvero quindi molto contento, ringrazio tantissimo Laura per aver organizzato questa cosa così bella e non vi dico altro se non buon lavoro e che appunto la luce continui a risplendere. Arrivederci.
Grazie a Marco Segala e possiamo dare inizio ai lavori di questo pomeriggio e con la presidenza di Livio Sbardella che insegna qui letteratura greca e che ci aiuterà nei lavori di oggi.
Allora penso mi sentiate anche senza microfono, oppure è importante per... vabbè, allora lo uso. Scusate, ma ho un'idiosincrasia per il microfono e quindi quando posso lo evito. Va bene, allora io mi unisco alle parole del direttore del Dipartimento nel ringraziare Laura in particolare per l'organizzazione di questa bella occasione di incontro qui da noi presso l'Università dell'Aquila. Laura ormai è famosa in tutto il mondo come organizzatrice di eventi, oltre che come collega che insegna greco, ma e questo mi aiuta anche un po' a presentarla. Laura ha sviluppato questa duplice competenza sia nello studio della letteratura greca sia nello studio della cultura materiale, dei papiri e quindi della papirologia, che le permette di muoversi così in modo anfibio su entrambi questi settori di competenza, che ovviamente hanno tra loro degli ampi margini di sovrapposizione, come ovvio, perché rappresentano poi soltanto branche specifiche del più ampio perimetro culturale che è lo studio dell'antichità, e quindi settorializzare è sempre, diciamo, da una parte comodo, ma dal punto di vista poi storico-culturale sconveniente. e proprio per questo figure che hanno questa capacità di muoversi, no, su tutta l'ampiezza del perimetro come fa Laura sono figure importanti e lo dimostrano anche sul piano della capacità organizzativa di occasioni come queste, proprio perché appunto riescono a mettere insieme competenze diverse e quindi anche a richiamare l'attenzione degli specialisti e degli studiosi sul complesso di queste competenze, e quindi per me è sempre stato un motivo di vanto averla come collega. Quindi la ringrazio per l'organizzazione di questa bella giornata che lei introduce, qui cominciamo, diciamo, la prima sessione di questa 2 giorni, che lei introduce con appunto una relazione introduttiva sul rapporto tra lingua e papiri. Non tolgo altro tempo e le cedo la parola.
Grazie a Livio per questa presentazione, forse troppo generosa, e quindi non togliamo altro tempo, non prendiamo altro tempo e proviamo a introdurre questo nostro convegno, queste giornate di lavoro. Dunque, a partire almeno dalla metà del XIX secolo, i papiri hanno offerto e lo sappiamo, un corpus sconfinato di testi nuovi. Rispetto al resto delle testimonianze letterarie e documentarie note fino a quel momento, destinato ad avere anche un notevole impatto su una pluralità di fronti differenti, da quello storico-economico a quello socioculturale a quello letterario. I materiali papirologici hanno permesso in particolare di comprendere meglio e di ampliare la stessa conoscenza della lingua greca, che è il nostro focus di queste giornate, e il tessuto costitutivo della dizione e dello stile di molti generi letterari, paraletterari e di una vastissima gamma di tipologie di testi d'uso a livello sia privato sia a livello ufficiale. Come sottolineato già all'inizio degli anni 2000, in un volume che tutti noi conosciamo, in un volume collettivo incentrato proprio sull'apporto della documentazione papirologica alla conoscenza della lingua, The Linguistic Significance of the Papyri rappresenta un'acquisizione importante e al tempo stesso problematica. Provando a semplificare al massimo e andando un po' all'osso del problema, indagare, per così dire, il greco dei papiri è un'impresa di per sé complicata. Una prima difficoltà, dalle apparizioni dei primi testimoni fino ad oggi, è data dalla natura frastagliata e frammentata della evidenza disponibile, che comporta, come è noto a tutti gli specialisti e anche ai semplici lettori di papiri, una difficoltà a orientarsi tra una selva di edizioni e corpora fluttuanti, spesso ricostruiti a partire da reperti che appartengono a collezioni disseminate in istituzioni di conservazione o collezioni private sparse nelle più svariate località europee e americane. Una seconda difficoltà, meno appariscente, è costituita poi dalla natura stessa della maggior parte delle indicazioni linguistiche fornite dalla documentazione papiracea, in cui tendono ad emergere non di rado alcuni aspetti dialettali, sfumature di senso, scelte sintattiche e usi peculiari che possono non corrispondere ai cosiddetti modelli della dizione letteraria o della forma documentaria standard, ricavati dalla critica a partire dalla tradizione più consolidata e tramandata in genere per via di trasmissione indiretta o diretta medievale e umanistica. Non esistono evidentemente delle risposte o delle soluzioni facili a questi due problemi, che comportano ulteriori difficoltà da affrontare in considerazione della specificità di ciascun tipo di testo, di ciascun genere e anche di ciascuna area culturale di riferimento. Alla prima questione, ad ogni modo, si è cercato di rispondere con la progressiva costituzione di database e repository testuali in cui sistemi di schedature progressivamente sempre più articolati e integrati fra di loro forniscono ormai la possibilità di costituire corpora testuali specifici sulla base del genere, del sottogenere, dell'autore, del periodo e rappresentano una indispensabile base di partenza per ricerche linguistiche sempre più dettagliate e approfondite. E in questa direzione risorse come Trismegistos e Papyri.info, nelle sue articolazioni del Duke Data Bank of Documentary Papyri e del Digital Corpus of Literary Papyri, che rappresentano un po' l'uso quotidiano per molti di noi, hanno definitivamente cambiato l'approccio all'individuazione e alla delimitazione dei corpora testuali, sia di natura letteraria sia documentaria. Sebbene non consentano sempre di sottrarre a linee d'ombra e a linee di confine tutta una serie di testi, ad esempio di ambito paraletterario, che non ricadono immediatamente all'interno di categorie facilmente definibili. È il caso in particolare di diversi testi letterari e paraletterari restituiti dai papiri che molto più di quelli documentari tendono a mostrare al loro interno differenze, sfumature, caratteristiche specifiche tali da arrivare persino a mettere in crisi le delimitazioni correnti, talora neppure chiaramente perspicue, tra i generi letterari. Il perimetro dei generi letterari, con le loro leggi variabili nel tempo e nello spazio, per utilizzare la terminologia e le categorizzazioni introdotte da Luigi Enrico Rossi in un lavoro seminale del 1971, ha rappresentato uno strumento interpretativo basato sull'idea che le scelte linguistiche fossero un potente elemento regolatore nell'ambito di testi appartenenti allo stesso genere. La lingua, dunque, con le sue carature espressive specifiche, costituisce uno degli elementi distintivi più importanti per la definizione di un testo letterario, per la sua eventuale collocazione all'interno di uno specifico genere letterario o anche per l'attribuzione a un determinato contesto storico o all'opera di un autore preciso. Questo sistema, fondato sull'idea di una combinazione precisa, biunivoca tra lingua e genere letterario, risulta oggi, grazie all'apporto dinamico rappresentato anche dalla documentazione restituita dai papiri, tutt'altro che stabile e lungi da un funzionamento puramente meccanico. I testi di nuova acquisizione rivelano invece molte più sfumature, soprattutto nel caso di tipologie testuali scarsamente documentate dalla tradizione diretta medievale, e hanno contribuito spesso a smontare l'idea di un funzionamento meccanico del sistema dei generi, mostrando irregolarità frutto spesso di condizionamenti determinati da contesti specifici di appartenenza o di destinazione, che le dinamiche di trasmissione tendono invece a eliminare, ad appiattire. E in questa direzione possono essere intesi, solo per indicare alcuni esempi tra i molti casi problematici in ottica linguistica, le presenze scomode sotto il profilo interpretativo di elementi, per esempio, di marchio dorico, per lo più traditi dalle evidenze papiracee, nella produzione elegiaca di Tirteo, Teognide o nel cosiddetto Nuovo Simonide, o nella produzione epica non omerica di Cherilo di Samo e di altri poeti di età arcaica e classica noti soltanto per via frammentaria. Ebbene, questa componente ci riporta alla seconda questione di cui facevo cenno prima, cioè l'inattesa varietà linguistica mostrata dai papiri. Il problema è stato affrontato variamente, spesso caso per caso, e non è mancata la tentazione, di fronte ad vere e proprie aberrazioni linguistiche inattese, di sperare che il rotolo papiraceo, grazie al quale si era arrivati a conoscenza di peculiarità così singolari, non fosse quasi mai stato ritrovato, perché metteva un po' in crisi, no, il nostro sistema dei generi. All'estremo opposto si colloca anche la reazione di studiosi che, di fronte a scostamenti importanti rispetto all'usus abituale, sono arrivati a ritenere che il testo, quando non anche il supporto papiraceo, fossero del tutto falsi. Basti soltanto ricordare la straripante letteratura sul papiro di Artemidoro, la cui autenticità è messa in dubbio in una vasta gamma di ragioni addotte anche sulla base delle caratteristiche peculiari della prosa del cosiddetto prologo. Al di là però delle posizioni più nette ed estreme rispetto a questo genere di problemi, è indubbio il peso che i papiri hanno avuto e continuano ad avere nella ridefinizione del profilo della lingua di molti generi letterari, a partire dai casi meglio documentati dell'epica, come i poemi omerici, dove la messe delle evidenze papiracee ha messo in luce, a volte provocando nei critici veri e propri vertigini interpretative, la multiformità e la stratificazione diacronica della dizione epica, la cui fissazione precoce non ha impedito la continua modificazione e l'inserzione di forme peculiari come riflesso del passaggio del testo in specifici contesti locali oppure in determinati contesti storici. Non irrilevante, d'altro canto, è l'apporto dei papiri alla comprensione della evoluzione e della progressiva trasformazione, sempre all'interno di un sistema molto stilizzato e codificato ai fini della riconoscibilità, della dizione epica successiva ai poemi omerici propriamente detti. E rilevanti in quest'ottica sono i casi del corpus Esiodeum, dei poemi del ciclo troiano e tebano, oltre al resto della tradizione epica arcaica e classica, spesso nota soltanto per il tramite di frustuli papiracei molto frammentari. Ebbene, in tutti questi casi, con le singole specificità, l'individuazione delle peculiarità linguistiche ha comportato sempre un acceso dibattito e la necessaria riconsiderazione anche dei meccanismi di fissazione e trasmissione dei testi, oltre alla scelta di una chiave interpretativa e di una linea che fosse efficace anche in sede ecdotica di presentazione dei testi. In definitiva, al di là delle singole scelte e delle visioni particolari, è indubbio che la tradizione papiracea ha fornito in molti casi la possibilità di ampliare lo sguardo sulle sfaccettature della dizione letteraria e ha dato l'opportunità di conservare e di vedere più da vicino e in dettaglio lo sviluppo diacronico di fenomeni della dizione, spesso soltanto accennati nella tradizione scolastica e grammaticale successiva. La possibilità offerta dai papiri di apprezzare una maggiore complessità nella dizione letteraria, in ogni caso, non ha comportato uno stravolgimento complessivo della fisionomia di un genere e delle opere che vi si riferiscono, e non è sempre una chiave di volta efficace per dirimere problemi di attribuzione di un testo poetico a un autore o a un periodo specifici. Tuttavia la percezione della complessità comporta ricadute dirette nelle scelte ecdotiche, soprattutto nel caso di testi frammentari o di testi adespoti, oppure nel caso di testi difficilmente riconducibili a opere ben definite. La varietà delle soluzioni attestate dai papiri rappresenta un antidoto a una tendenza filologica largamente attestata specificamente soprattutto nel corso del XX secolo, quella tendenza cioè a normalizzare a tutti i costi la lingua letteraria con esiti persino banalizzanti e anche con il rischio di fraintendere le complessità del testo. Persino la datazione dei testi e la cronologia proposta per i fenomeni letterari è stata influenzata da questa tendenza, in quanto, per esempio, talune variazioni linguistiche sono state considerate più tarde solo sulla base di una mancata aderenza a uno standard linguistico che risulta lungi dall'essere stabilito, con la conseguenza di ricondurre magari espressioni letterarie importanti a un contesto cronologico potenzialmente molto diverso da quello originario. E questo aspetto si rivela particolarmente rilevante nel caso di generi letterari che per lunghi periodi risultano sommersi o addirittura perduti, come è il caso dell'epica classica o ellenistico-imperiale, i cui molti testi frammentati e adespoti, difficilmente, data anche la loro facies linguistica altamente formalizzata e stilizzata, si lasciano ricondurre in maniera univoca a un dato periodo o a uno specifico autore. Gli esempi relativi all'apporto dei papiri alla conoscenza, all'ampliamento e alla messa in discussione della dizione letteraria potrebbero sicuramente moltiplicarsi, spaziando dall'epica alla lirica, al teatro, alle esperienze multiformi della poesia ellenistica, con le molte voci dalle sfumature dialettali varie. Eppure la centralità dei papiri nella comprensione della lingua, nelle sue sfaccettature che dai livelli più elevati sfumano verso le forme quotidiane e popolari, fino alla rappresentazione delle voci delle lingue straniere e delle potenzialità espressive del bilinguismo greco-latino, si è rivelata altrettanto decisiva per i testi documentari. Le molte forme dei testi documentari, infatti, oggi sempre più diffusamente e capillarmente sono state riunite in corpora ampi, di facile reperibilità, e questo processo, anche grazie ai repositories testuali online, ne ha facilitato la lettura o la rilettura in una trama di corrispondenze reciproche articolata, con la possibilità, ad esempio, di individuare spesso pattern formulari, ricorrenze strutturali, abitudini e tendenze d'uso nell'ambito di lessici tecnici specifici, marcatori chiari sotto il profilo fonomorfologico e sintattico della funzione comunicativa di ciascun testo, anche in relazione ad eventuali necessità espressive orali o scritte dettate dall'occasione pubblica o privata contingente. Non di rado si è avuta la possibilità, in questa maniera, di ricomporre quadri dettagliati relativi ai realien, alla storia socio-economica e a una pluralità di lessici tecnici. Gli studi di questo tipo, negli ultimi anni, come è ben noto, si sono concentrati in una pluralità di direzioni differenti, ma risultati di particolare rilievo si sono ottenuti a partire dalla possibilità di connettere oggetti trovati negli scavi effettuati in Egitto a termini attestati nella documentazione papirologica, ma rari invece o del tutto assenti in quelle che potremo definire con una semplificazione le fonti letterarie. Si arriva in casi del genere a praticare una seriazione dei dati lessicali o, più in generale, alla costituzione di studi linguistici fondati su un contatto diretto con i veicoli materiali dei testi. Si pensi, ad esempio, al progetto LexPap-Mat, promosso dall'Istituto Papirologico Vitelli e dall'IFAO, che rappresenta un notevole arricchimento dei lessici, non soltanto per quanto riguarda lo studio di sostantivi che rischierebbero di apparire apax, ma anche per termini dotati di un pedigree letterario. È il caso, solo per fare un esempio, del termine iupselos, il termine che indica il significato di sublime in contesto letterario, ma usato nel lessico quotidiano indica la qualità di certi medicamenti o addirittura è impiegato per capi di abbigliamento che forse di sublime dovevano avere ben poco, ma faceva probabilmente riferimento alla lunghezza e ad aspetti specifici della manifattura del tessuto che al momento non siamo ancora in grado di capire molto bene. E ricordo qui gli studi dell'amica Simona Russo che molto si è applicata a questo campo. Lo spettro semantico delle parole si rivela quindi molto più ampio di quello che possiamo immaginare se ci limitiamo a restare nell'ambito dei testi letterari, per così dire, canonici, oppure se pratichiamo l'osservazione dei testi partendo dal presupposto che esista una barriera netta fra i testi letterari e quelli documentari. Sotto questo profilo, invece, proprio la documentazione papiracea garantisce, anche dall'angolo visuale privilegiato dell'indagine linguistica, una evidenza fondamentale per comprendere la complessità e anche la permeabilità dei reami letterario e documentario nella produzione testuale greca. L'alto livello di articolazione lessicale, sintattica e più in generale espressiva della galassia dei testi documentari e paraletterari, con i molti addentellati e punti di contatto rispetto ai testi letterari, è sempre più indagato e individuato nel caso di testi di natura scolastica, grammaticale, nei lessici, con particolare attenzione a quelli bilingui. In casi del genere, la possibilità di sfruttare i database per ricerche incrociate consente di integrare i corpora esistenti, spesso inevitabilmente invecchiati, e di fare luce su terminologie specifiche, sulle pratiche didattiche nella scuola di primo e secondo livello, sulla interrelazione e ibridazione continua tra lingue e culture differenti nell'Egitto greco-romano e poi tardo-antico, dove i materiali papiracei sopravvissuti consentono di osservare le molte interazioni fra greco ed egiziano, dal demotico al copto, e anche tra greco e latino, mostrando uno spettro di ibridazioni che sta emergendo con sempre maggiore chiarezza. Questi corpora testuali, infatti, pur nella loro eterogeneità e profonda diversificazione interna per contenuti, forme e nella loro lunga durata in senso diacronico, con sviluppi che originano almeno secondo quanto può desumersi dalle testimonianze dirette superstiti tra la fine dell'età classica e il primo ellenismo e arrivano alle porte del Medioevo, mostrano però una ricorsività strutturale, formale e tematica che ne garantiscono l'intellegibilità come fenomeni con tratti costanti e funzioni abbastanza stabilizzate nel tempo, tanto da lasciarsi esaminare anche in termini di costanti linguistiche, sintattiche e persino formulari. Ed è significativo che studi linguistici su questa tipologia di corpora abbiano messo in luce, sfruttando appieno la possibilità di indicizzare occorrenze su un ventaglio cronologico ampio e partendo da un corpus che comprende ormai migliaia di testi strutturati secondo regole formali analoghe, anche un fenomeno costante di penetrazione degli stilemi di un linguaggio più squisitamente letterario tra le pieghe di documenti o di testi di natura quotidiana e privata. E in più, nell'ultimo periodo, ancora sul fronte dei papiri che tramandano testi documentari, l'applicazione combinata delle tecniche di indagine filologico-linguistica e dei metodi di linguistica computazionale abbinati a un'osservazione precisa della materialità dei testi ha consentito di ricostruire processi sociocomunicativi articolati alla base di precise scelte espressive. Le potenzialità di questo campo di indagine sono evidentemente lungi dall'essere del tutto esplorate e oggi vanno messe alla prova anche dell'applicazione dell'intelligenza artificiale in tutte le sue varie forme, che può forse fornire un ausilio soprattutto nel caso dell'individuazione di aspetti ricorrenti e seriali in pattern strutturali ad alta riconoscibilità, sebbene le inevitabili sfumature funzionali e le caratteristiche peculiari rimarranno difficili da categorizzare e da intendere senza l'occhio esperto, sensibile e allenato alla filologia, alla storia e prima ancora alla papirologia. Nel corso dei 2 anni di questo nostro progetto abbiamo esplorato tipologie testuali differenti, sia letterarie sia documentarie, e ci siamo confrontati sui criteri da seguire per organizzare cataloghi digitali di reperti papiracei funzionali e al tempo stesso esaustivi. La scrittura e la materialità dei frammenti sono stati l'inevitabile punto di partenza, ma le valutazioni delle caratteristiche linguistiche ha inciso su tante delle nostre scelte, anche soltanto per individuare i frammenti su cui concentrare gli sforzi ecdotici. Ci è sembrato opportuno allora dedicare questo incontro corale proprio a questo problema, mettendo in contatto testi e tradizioni di studio differenti. Sin dall'inizio del nostro percorso abbiamo rifiutato la pretesa di arrivare a assunti prescrittivi e oggi non vogliamo proporre delle conclusioni, ma sono certa che tutte le voci di questo convegno nella loro pluralità contribuiranno ad offrire nuove prospettive e esplorare trasversalmente i riflessi molteplici di una lingua, quella greca, che per il tramite dei frammenti di papiro o anche per questo tramite si dimostra sempre più vivace e multiforme. E vi ringrazio per essere qua e spero che queste giornate siano proficue per tutti noi.
Ringraziamo Laura Lulli per questa introduzione generale all'argomento di questa 2 giorni convegnistica e invitiamo il professor Fournet a sedersi qui al seggio del relatore e con lui di fatto apriamo la prima sessione del convegno dedicata proprio alle interferenze tra cultura materiale e letteratura, quindi tra papiri e letteratura, che appunto le contaminazioni tra linguaggi e codici documentari e letteratura sono proprio uno dei campi di studio che caratterizzano gli studi del professor Fournet, che è professore di cultura scritta nella tarda antichità e papirologia al Collège de France. È stato in precedenza ricercatore presso il CNRS di Strasburgo e professore di papirologia greca presso l'École pratique des hautes études. Ha una produzione scientifica vastissima, di cui è anche inutile cercare di rendere conto, ma tra le sue monografie più importanti ricordiamo un volume sull'ellenismo nell'Egitto del VI secolo d.C., e in particolare sulla biblioteca e l'opera di Dioscoro di Afrodito, poi una monografia del 1999, poi una monografia su Alessandria come comunità linguistica, e quindi la questione del greco ad Alessandria del 2009, e anche una monografia sugli ieroglifica di Orapollon, che risale piuttosto recente al 2021. Il titolo dell'intervento del professor Fournier è leggermente modificato rispetto a quello che ci aveva comunicato in precedenza. Quand la littérature s'amiche dans les documents, essai des typologies du phénomène de littérarité documentaire. Questo è il titolo per esteso. La parola al professor Fournier.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Alors, je voudrais commencer... Je m'exprimerai en français. Je voudrais commencer par remercier les organisateurs de ce colloque et surtout Laura de m'avoir invité. Je suis extrêmement heureux d'être ici, de découvrir cette ville et de découvrir aussi le dynamisme scientifique de cette université. Alors, je désire, si cela dépendait de moi, mêler les grâces aux muses, comme on dit. Et c'est l'objectif que je mets au-dessus de tout. Cependant, mes préoccupations me portent dans une autre direction et je me laisse entraîner, bien qu'à contre-cœur, par la nécessité qui me presse. La composition de mes histoires, tâche des plus grandes et des plus nobles, et pour citer le poète lyrique de Béotie, au-dessus de toute occupation, devient une activité secondaire et occasionnelle, et je suis par conséquent incapable de vivre le plus agréablement possible en me consacrant pleinement à ce qui m'intéresse. Et bien qu'il me faudrait plus à loisir lire les œuvres des grands esprits de l'Antiquité pour m'en servir de modèle, examiner et investiguer avec un regard critique l'ensemble des événements historiques et employer un esprit détendu et sans entrave à l'étude de ces questions, eh bien je suis je suis au contraire retenu à mon bureau dans le Basilios Stoa, du matin au coucher du soleil, à ouvrir et à traiter 1000 documents relatifs à des procès et des affaires. Alors, il s'agit d'un texte que l'on doit à Agathias, le célèbre historien et poète. C'est une confession qu'il fait dans ses histoires et qui est révélatrice de la façon dont on pouvait concevoir le rapport entre littérature et le monde des affaires, si je puis dire. À croire Agathias, la littérature appartient à une sphère qui est radicalement étrangère au monde des documents. Il utilise le terme biblidia, que nous, les papyrologues, nous connaissons bien, puisque ça désigne notamment les pétitions. Et les exigences que son travail de scholastikos, qui l'oblige à lire et à rédiger de nombreux documents dans le domaine juridique et judiciaire, le tient éloigné de la lecture des grands auteurs qui pourraient l'aider à améliorer son style et son esprit critique. Mais nous sommes dans un prologue, lieu éminemment rhétorique où il est de tradition qu'un auteur se dévalorise à des fins de captatio benevolentiae. D'ailleurs, la langue qu'utilise Agathias, par les nombreuses références littéraires et surtout poétiques, j'en ai noté quelques-unes à l'écran, nous envoie un message subliminal qui nous montre à la fois qu'il a fréquenté les bons auteurs et que écrire en prose n'interdit pas le recours à la poésie. Bien au contraire. Autrement dit, le monde de la littérature est loin d'être antinomique de celui des documents, contrairement à ce que notre sensibilité moderne pourrait nous le laisser penser. C'est ce que j'aimerais vous montrer aujourd'hui avec les papyrus documentaires de l'Antiquité tardive. Ces dernières années, de nombreux travaux ont tenté de réduire la distance entre littérature et documents, voire de réinterroger, d'un point de vue épistémologique, le bien fondé de cette catégorisation, documentaire. Plus exactement, de cette polarisation documentaire. Et je voudrais citer un ouvrage qui est sorti juste avant l'été, publié, édité par Antonio Ricciardetto et moi-même, « Appréhender la culture écrite des anciens, la catégorisation en papyrologie et ses limites », qui est en fait les actes d'un colloque qui avait eu lieu au Collège de France en 2019, si mes souvenirs sont bons. Alors cette polarisation en fait catégorielle est d'autant plus inopérante que les normes du langage écrit à des fins non littéraires ont profondément changé à partir du 2e, 3e siècle après Jésus-Christ, d'où les limites du sujet que j'ai adopté ce soir. Alors donc l'objectif de ma contribution est moins de m'intéresser aux auteurs qui sont cités dans les documents ou qui ont influencé la langue des documents, que d'étudier la façon dont la littérature s'immisce dans les documents. Alors, je partirai d'un exemple, une pétition du VIe siècle. On y retrouve les différents procédés par lesquels la littérature, justement, s'immisce dans le document. Alors, examinons-les dans l'ordre, on va dire, décroissant de leur littérarité. Et là, j'utilise un terme très jacobsonien. Alors, commençons par, évidemment, le procédé le plus évident, l'insertion d'un court extrait d'œuvre ou de citation. C'est ce que nous avons à la ligne 7 de l'exemple que je vous propose, avec un vers de l'Iliade. Alors, en général, il y a plusieurs types de citations dans les documents. Ces citations peuvent être clairement délimitées avec le nom de l'auteur. Vous en avez un exemple ici avec une lettre d'un personnage non identifié, mais peu importe. Vous voyez qu'il y a une citation, « Cat Homéron », selon Homère, le nom est donné. Vous avez des citations où le nom de l'auteur n'est pas donné, mais on utilise une périphrase pour le désigner. Là encore, voici deux documents, une lettre où on utilise Homère, mais on ne donne pas son nom, on dit juste l'ancien. Ou bien, par exemple, un extrait des psaumes dans une autre lettre, une lettre pétition, vous voyez qu'on utilise le terme de hieropsaltos. On peut aussi, par désir de ne pas paraître pédant, introduire la citation par une formulation vague, comme le fait Agathias dans le texte que je vous ai montré, où il utilise facie, on dit pour une référence directe à Euripide, mais dans bien des cas, les scripteurs ne connaissaient pas ces citations ou ne les connaissaient que comme des proverbes entrés dans l'usage et qu'ils démarquent dans leurs documents comme tels. Et c'est le cas de cette célèbre lettre adressée à la boulée d'Hermopolis, où vous avez une référence à Euripide qui est donnée comme une espèce de proverbe ancien, kat archaion logon. Enfin, la citation peut ne pas être du tout démarquée, à la charge évidemment pour le lecteur de la deviner, de la déceler. Là, vous avez le cas d'une lettre où vous avez une référence odysséenne, mais il n'y a absolument rien qui permette de voir qu'il s'agit d'une référence à Homère. Alors, la citation est théoriquement la forme de greffe, j'utilise cette métaphore de greffe littéraire, à la fois la plus ostensible et celle qui brouille le moins les limites entre littéraire et documentaire, dans la mesure où elle se présente comme une entité externe et bien délimitée qui ne cherche pas à se fondre dans le tissu linguistique d'arrivée. C'est probablement pour cette raison que la citation est autorisée par les théoriciens de l'épistolographie antique, qui défendent généralement un purisme très atticiste, interdisant les effets de style très voyant. Alors, un exemple avec Julius Victor, par exemple, qui dit qu'il est très avantageux d'user d'un proverbe qui n'est pas inconnu, ainsi que d'un vers ou d'une partie de vers. Vous avez aussi le pseudo-Libanios qui parle de la possibilité, quand on écrit des lettres, d'avoir recours à des œuvres antiques. Alors, il nous faut annexer le proverbe au phénomène de la citation d'auteur, pour autant que les théoriciens de l'épistolographie traitent des deux ensemble. Comme vous le voyez avec le passage du pseudo-Libanios, il met les proverbes dans la même catégorie que les citations d'auteur. Même si finalement le proverbe, en tant qu'énoncé d'usage commun et relevant d'une sagesse populaire, n'a pas le même degré de littérarité qu'une citation. Mais comme on l'a vu avec la lettre adressée à la Boulée, vous voyez que bien des citations d'Homère ou de Tragique étaient devenues des proverbes et n'étaient plus perçues comme des extraits d'auteurs. C'est d'ailleurs ce qui s'est produit avec les maximes de Ménandre, les sentences de Ménandre, originellement des vers de Ménandre, devenus au prix d'adaptation et de l'absorption d'un matériau exogène, qui est devenu un recueil de maximes édifiantes. Et d'ailleurs, la maxime et l'apophthegme, comme le proverbe, relèvent du même phénomène que les citations. Alors, passons maintenant à un autre cas. La citation d'Homère n'est pas la seule référence à Homère dans la pétition qui nous sert de point de départ. On trouve à la ligne 16 « Meta ton nepion technon », qui est un syntagme, les petits-enfants, qui est évidemment un clin d'œil aussi à Homère. Pour autant que cette expression, nepia techna, n'est pas passée dans l'usage courant. On ne la trouve quasiment jamais dans les papyrus. On ne la trouve même jamais dans les papyrus. Alors, à la ligne précédente, on trouve aussi une expression intéressante. Il parle de spasmata, etc. Algedonas azekeis. Et là, on a évidemment une faute pour azekeis, algedonas azekeis. Alors, le mot azekeis est un adjectif complètement épique qui fait directement référence à Homère, et notamment au chant 15 vers 25 de l'Iliade, où il est employé précisément pour une douleur, comme ici, algedonas. Alors, ce type de référence, qui est irradié, on va dire, par un ou deux mots combinés, est extrêmement fréquent dans les documents, en tout cas les documents écrits d'une certaine tenue. Alors, pour quitter le domaine de la pétition et celui d'Homère, je renverrai par exemple aux lettres des archives de Théophane du IVe siècle, comme par exemple ce papyrus, le P. Hermopolis 6, qui est truffé de mots empruntés au tragique et à Platon, à l'unisson justement, et c'est ça qui est intéressant, du profil culturel et religieux du cercle de lettrés au centre duquel se trouve justement Théophane. En dehors de la culture classique, le christianisme, à son tour aussi, va imposer une marque si profonde sur la langue que tout un lexique qui est directement issu de la Bible et de la liturgie va envahir les lettres, pas seulement les lettres, d'autres formes d'écrit, et devenir à ce point usuel qu'on peut se demander finalement s'il relève du phénomène de littérarité. Les syntagmes peuvent parfois renvoyer à plusieurs auteurs à la fois, combinant des colorations culturelles qui peuvent être très diverses, et voire même presque contradictoires. Par exemple, avec cette pétition des archives de Dioscore, cette pétition même de Dioscore, où il accuse le pagarque et ses sbires. Et il nous dit que le pagarque donne toute impunité à sa horde de bergers vagabonds. Tois agraolusi melonomois. Alors, l'expression est tout à fait intéressante. On reconnaît une référence à Luc, 2.8, poimenes agroluntes, référence qui elle-même peut-être est influencée lointainement par Homère, dans laquelle Dioscore a substitué au mot prosaïque poimen le mot poétique et peu fréquent mélonomos, qui est utilisé par Euripide, Oppien, Quintus de Smyrne, et évidemment par Nonos. Et il l'a fait probablement sous l'influence directe de Nonos, qui est un auteur qu'il connaissait bien, Nonos Dionysiaque 15-18, où vous trouvez l'expression mélonomon agrolon. Et là, on a presque affaire au syntagme que nous avons dans notre papyrus. Donc vous voyez que c'est un cas intéressant de télescopage en fait de types de références chrétiennes et références classiques. Alors bien souvent, nos documents livrent des mots qui ne sont pas des références directes à des auteurs ou un passage de l'œuvre d'un auteur. Ils sont employés pour la coloration, on va dire, littéraire qu'ils apportent et pour l'effet qui en découle. Je vais prendre un petit peu d'eau. Ces mots littéraires sont souvent des poétismes. Merci. Ces mots littéraires sont souvent des poétismes, du fait évidemment de la place surplombante, je dirais, des poètes grecs et surtout des poètes épiques et tragiques dans la culture grecque, et surtout du contraste qu'ils créent justement avec le langage de tous les jours. Alors, on se souvient qu'Isocrate, lorsqu'il opposait les vers du poète à la prose de l'orateur, regrette que ce dernier, l'orateur, ne dispose d'aucun, voici le texte de Evagoras, texte célèbre, ne dispose d'aucun des procédés d'ornement, des kosmoi, comme il dit, que peut utiliser le poète, à savoir les mots étrangers, les xénas, les néologismes, les kainas, les transpositions de sens ou métaphores, métaphorailles, sans compter évidemment les charmes du maître, les métras et du rite, mais les rutmailles. L'orateur, celui qui utilise la prose, est condamné, nous dit Isocrate, est condamné à utiliser les mots de la langue courante, c'est-à-dire une très belle expression, presque mallarméenne, les mots de la cité. Aussi, les poétismes de nos documents n'ont souvent pour fonction que d'enfreindre cette bipartition poétique théorique qu'endosse Isocrate. Ils ont pour fonction d'élever le discours au-dessus de la platitude de la langue d'usage en introduisant une rupture stylistique. Le caractère indéterminé de ces termes littérarisants rend d'ailleurs leur identification souvent délicate, car nous ne savons pas toujours si leur emploi dans un document implique une rupture voulue par le rédacteur ou si ces termes ne sont pas rentrés antérieurement dans l'usage de la prose soignée. Aussi doit-on manier avec beaucoup de prudence, par exemple, la liste des poétismes papyrologiques qu'a dressé il y a déjà longtemps Henrik Tsidiakus dans son ouvrage Zur Abundanz der spätgriechischen Gebrauchssprache. On a un bon exemple de ces poétismes vagues d'interprétation délicate avec le syntagme keiran, keira évidemment orexai, de la pétition qui nous sert d'exemple de départ. Alors l'expression est homérique, on la retrouve en plus chez Euripide, mais aussi chez les poètes épiques tardifs comme Nonos, dans les Dionysiaques évidemment, et le pseudo-apollinaire de la Odyssée, dans la paraphrase des psaumes qui a connu une certaine célébrité à l'époque. Son sémantisme, tendre la main, son sémantisme évidemment, était propice au fait qu'il puisse entrer dans l'arsenal métaphorique de la pétition, et justement, il est utilisé dans des pétitions comme celle que vous avez à l'écran, Basile, une pétition qui est reportée par Évagre, ou une autre qu'on a retrouvée sur Papyrus. Aussi, l'auteur de notre pétition à nous a pu être influencé directement par la phraséologie des pétitions, mais connaissant bien Homère, et on le voit puisqu'il cite directement Homère, eh bien, s'ajoutait probablement l'intention d'introduire dans son texte un homérisme supplémentaire. Alors on voit aussi augmenter à partir du IVe siècle et surtout, je dirais, culminer au VIe siècle après Jésus-Christ, le nombre d'atticismes dans les papyrus, comme par exemple Taton pour Tachyon, Téméron pour Séméron, Gignomai, etc. etc. Bon. Paradoxalement, les atticismes relèvent du phénomène des poétismes, du fait de la collusion entre atticisme et poésie à partir de la seconde sophistique. Et Synésus, justement, dit en parlant de ses études que Calliope servait aux élèves un abondant repas de mots attiques recherchés, assaisonnés de poésie. Vous voyez qu'il y a la collusion entre les deux qui est intéressante. Il n'y a pas de doute, par exemple, que le recours à oista à la place de oida ou du duel duoin, dans cette lettre des archontes et des bouleutes d'Antinopolis à l'épistratège, que l'usage de ces deux mots reflète les intentions des auteurs de s'exprimer dans une langue qui leur fasse honneur et dont témoigne par ailleurs le soin avec lequel leur argumentation est construite. Mais dans bien des cas, les atticismes que l'on trouve dans nos papyrus ne sont pas systématiques à l'intérieur d'un même document et côtoient de ce que j'appellerais des vulgarismes ou des maladresses. Aussi, aurais-je tendance à penser que les atticismes constituent un indice qui, en soi, se situe assez bas sur l'échelle, on va dire, de la littérarité documentaire et qu'ils ne sont signifiants, ou qu'il n'est signifiant cet indice qu'en conjonction avec d'autres indices concordants. Donc, du coup, je n'insisterai pas trop sur ce type de termes. Alors, passons à notre catégorie, les archaïsmes. Il s'agit là encore d'une catégorie qui relève souvent des poétismes, mais pas toujours. Les archaïsmes font partie des ornements du style et sont recommandés, par exemple, par les théoriciens de l'épistolographie à condition d'être utilisés de façon très parcimonieuse. Un exemple avec le mot euthénia, que vous retrouvez dans ce papyrus du VIe siècle. Il s'agit d'une pétition. Le pétitionnaire se plaint d'en être réduit, lui et ses enfants, à manger du pain sec. Eneca tes euthenias. John Ray, l'éditeur de ce papyrus, voyait dans Euthenia probablement une erreur pour asthénia. Mais non, en fait, pas du tout. Il faut voir dans ce terme, en fait, un synonyme du mot grec embolé, anona, la nonne, comme l'a montré Triantafylopoulos dans un article, paru en 1967. Et il faut comprendre en fait que le pétitionnaire n'a plus rien à manger après avoir payé, à cause des impôts, après avoir payé en fait la nonne. Mais ce que n'a pas vu Triantafylopoulos, c'est que ce mot en fait est devenu un total archaïsme au VIe siècle, ayant disparu du vocabulaire fiscal depuis au moins un siècle. Et donc son emploi ici dans cette pétition crée un effet stylistique. Alors la coloration archaïsante d'un mot peut tenir seulement au sens qu'il a dans le document, ce que j'appellerais une sorte d'archaïsme sémantique. Ainsi, dans une très belle lettre à Apajan qui était un célèbre holyman de la montagne de Lycopolis, connu aussi par les sources littéraires, mais par un dossier de papyrus documentaire, eh bien, dans cette lettre, un diacre fait l'éloge d'Apajan, en disant « Maintenant, nous sommes bien heureux, car nous t'avons, toi, Apajan, comme Scopos et comme père très bon. » Alors, Scopos, Wilken s'est dit « Mais c'est sûrement une erreur pour épiscopos. Nous t'avons comme évêque. » Guédini pensait même que Scopos est une espèce d'aphérèse permise, disons, par l'évolution de la langue. Mais non, pas du tout. Apajan n'a jamais été évêque. Il était anachorète. Et donc, en fait, il faut, pour suivre Naldini, il faut voir dans ce terme le mot skopos, qui est un vieux terme homérique, qui signifie le gardien, le protecteur, le guetteur, celui qui fait la sentinelle, et qui, sous l'influence de la Septante, est devenu en fait une désignation du prophète. Le prophète en tant que guetteur placé par Dieu sur une hauteur pour qu'il voie plus haut que son peuple et pour qu'il puisse l'avertir des dangers. Mais le sens de guetteur a fini vite par se raréfier au profit de skopos, le but, la fin, qui est l'unique sens vraiment attesté dans le grec post-classique. Et les pères de l'Église, qui étaient exégètes de la Bible, avaient conscience que ce mot n'était plus compris. Et Origène se sent obligé de l'expliquer en disant que les gens butent dessus par méconnaissance des Écritures. Et donc vous voyez que c'est dans ce sens archaïque et métaphorique que le mot est ici employé, avec d'autant plus d'à-propos qu'Apajan passait pour avoir des dons de prophétie. L'auteur donc de cette lettre maîtrise très bien les Écritures, et d'ailleurs vous voyez qu'il cite plus haut un passage des Écritures. Il maîtrise très bien les Écritures, c'est un bon lettré, ce qui est confirmé par la correction de son grec, la qualité de son écriture et, comme vous le voyez aussi, l'usage de certains raffinements graphiques comme l'utilisation d'esprits rudes. À 2 reprises, il note les esprits, ce qui est la marque de quelqu'un qui maîtrise très bien les codes graphiques. Alors, Isocrate, vous vous souvenez, dans l'extrait d'Evagoras, mettait les néologismes au nombre des procédés auxquels a droit de recourir le poète. Dans la mesure où il rompt avec la langue commune, le néologisme est un fort marqueur de littérarité. Mais il n'est pas toujours facile, vu l'état évidemment lacunaire de nos sources, d'attribuer aux rédacteurs de nos documents les mots nouveaux, les apax qu'on y rencontre. Alors, je voudrais vous en donner un exemple avec une pétition toujours la même, celle de Dioscore, que je citais tout à l'heure, où il utilise le mot tumoléontophthoros, destructeur comme un lion enragé. Il utilise ce mot pour désigner le pagarque, menace contre lesquelles il soumet cette pétition. Pétition qui est... il utilise ce mot, et ce mot est très intéressant. Il est saturé de littérarité dans la mesure où il fusionne 2 composés grecs. Le premier, c'est tumo léon, au cœur de lion, qui est un mot évidemment qui remonte à Homère, mais qui a chez Homère toujours une connotation positive. Il désigne Achille. En l'adaptant au contexte d'une pétition, Dioscore lui donne un sens négatif. Et là, on voit un phénomène que Trader appelle la contrast imitation. Mais en faisant cela, il est probablement influencé par la connotation péjorative qu'a acquise chez les auteurs chrétiens la figure du lion. Et je donne un exemple avec la première lettre de Pierre. Comme un lion rugissant, votre adversaire, le diacre, rôde autour de vous. Et le second composé qui a aidé Dioscore à former ce mot, eh bien, c'est tumophtoros, qui est, là encore, un terme homérique, qui détruit l'âme, qui brise l'âme, d'où destructeur. Donc vous voyez qu'on a affaire à un mot nouveau, une création verbale, qui crée par fusion une espèce d'hyper-homérisme, tout en modifiant le sens sous l'influence d'un passage néo-testamentaire. Donc c'est un exemple assez complexe. Alors, outre le lexique, il y a beaucoup d'autres stratégies langagières auxquelles on pouvait avoir recours pour donner de la littérarité à un écrit. Elles sont si nombreuses qu'il serait vain d'en faire la liste dans le cadre de ma communication. Je me limiterai à 2 cas. D'abord, les allitérations. C'est un autre aspect de la littérarisation d'un document qui est justement l'attention portée à la musicalité de la phrase. C'est un domaine qui est très vierge, on va dire. À ma connaissance, aucun papyrologue s'est intéressé réellement à la musicalité des papyrus documentaires. Mais je pense que c'est un domaine qui pourrait être extrêmement fécond. Je me contenterai juste d'évoquer rapidement différents cas. Alors, par exemple, avec une autre pétition de Dioscore, où vous avez une multiplication d'homéotélotes et de paromoioses, donc de mots qui commencent et qui finissent par les mêmes. Par exemple, dikaiosune kai dikaioprageias, tas produs prolampusine, pantata eage monasteria, pansepta eucteria, etc., etc. Vous voyez, ce prologue est plein d'effets de répétition, etc. Mais le soin porté à la construction musicale de la phrase ne se rencontre pas que dans des documents par excellence rhétoriques comme les pétitions et évidemment les préambules de pétitions, mais aussi dans les plus communs documents, les documents les plus formulaires, comme les documents juridiques, avec notamment les énumérations qu'ils contiennent fréquemment. Là, vous en avez une, on est au début du 7e siècle, sans avoir subi, je fais ce testament sans avoir subi aucune ruse, ni crainte, ni pression, ni tromperie, ni contrainte que ce soit, sans aucune distorsion, ni escroquerie juridique, etc. etc. Bon, on retrouve souvent dans les documents juridiques ce type d'énumération. Eh bien, lorsque vous regardez ces énumérations, vous voyez qu'elles sont faites de façon à multiplier les homéotélotes, notamment dolou, kai phobou, apates, kai anankes, kai passes, paragraphes, pantoyas, oyas depote, diconoias, kakonoias, etc., etc. C'est extrêmement net, c'est évidemment pas fait au hasard. Et je voudrais vous montrer que c'est un phénomène qui n'est absolument pas casuel ou contingent avec le dernier exemple. Il y en aurait beaucoup d'autres. C'est une série d'énumérations à la fin d'un contrat de vente, ou plutôt à la fin d'une dialucis, d'une liquidation de litige. Après avoir été soumis à la question formelle sur tous les points susmentionnés, je reconnais que tel est le cas, que je m'engage à fournir, à faire, à conserver, à respecter, à accomplir, à mener à bien cette dialucis. Ekein, dosein, poiein, fulatein, emenein, plérosein, eisperas again. Donc ein. Mais on a cette série de ein uniquement parce que, en fait, il a remplacé, vous voyez, des séries de présents, il a remplacé 2 présents par des futurs. Vous avez plérosein et vous avez dosein, parce que s'il n'avait pas fait ça, on aurait didonai et plérosai, ou plérun. Et du coup, ça aurait rompu cette... Et donc, il a préféré changer, mettre un futur uniquement pour avoir une série de ein. Donc, en fait, la forme passe avant le sens. Et ça, c'est extrêmement intéressant. Alors, vous avez aussi les rythmes et les clausules qui sont très importantes. Là aussi, c'est un domaine qui est extrêmement... Enfin, qui n'est pas étudié dans les papyrus documentaires. Je me contenterai d'en signaler un avec une autre pétition qui est probablement de Dioscore, mais qui n'est pas écrite par sa main, où vous avez cette phrase. Car quand le pauvre en arrive à refermer les mains, il clôt ainsi la bouche. Si vous scandez, vous verrez que vous n'avez que des yambes. Et donc ce rythme parfaitement yambique est évidemment intentionnel, car il met en exergue une phrase qui n'est pas n'importe quelle phrase, qui est une maxime à valeur de sentence, qui, comme celle de Ménandre, se devait évidemment d'être de rythme yambique. Alors, je voudrais juste terminer en disant que la littérarité n'est pas qu'une question de mots, c'est aussi une question, on va dire, de graphisme, d'écriture. Elle se traduit aussi au niveau de l'écriture par tout un tas de procédés sur lesquels je vais vite passer parce qu'il se trouve que ces dernières années, j'ai travaillé dessus. Je vais être obligé de me citer. Je suis désolé de faire un peu d'autocitation. Mais voilà, ces différents procédés, parmi ces procédés, le premier, c'est d'utiliser une écriture littéraire. Alors, voilà quelques références bibliographiques, mais je voudrais juste vous montrer un exemple avec une lettre qui vient justement du dossier de Théophane dont je parlais tout à l'heure, que je compare avec des papyrus littéraires. Vous voyez qu'on a affaire à un texte qui, si on ne savait pas qu'il s'agit d'une lettre, on aurait pu dire que c'est un texte littéraire. Le deuxième procédé graphique, ce sont ce que j'ai appelé dans un article les diacritiques culturelles, c'est-à-dire les accents, les esprits, les points que l'on rajoute dans les textes documentaires, alors qu'en règle générale, on ne le fait jamais, pour montrer que, pour donner un peu de lustre, de noblesse aux documents que l'on écrit. Voilà, j'ai eu l'occasion de traiter de ce sujet à 2 reprises, et il se trouve que tout à l'heure, je vous en ai montré un exemple, avec l'utilisation de 2 esprits dans une lettre qui, par ailleurs, montre que la personne a essayé de faire un vrai travail de littérarisation de sa langue. Et puis le dernier exemple, c'est ce que j'ai appelé aussi dans un autre article la rhétorique graphique, c'est-à-dire en fait l'utilisation de changements de style graphique pour pouvoir créer une espèce de rhétorique, et notamment dans les pétitions, vous avez l'utilisation de cette écriture extrêmement dilatée qui est utilisée uniquement pour la personne à qui on s'adresse, comme pour lui faire honneur, pour lui rendre hommage, alors que vous voyez que le nom de celui qui écrit, lui, est écrit dans une écriture beaucoup plus plébéienne, beaucoup plus normale, si je puis dire. Et donc, ça crée une espèce de rhétorique graphique qui met à l'honneur la personne à qui on s'adresse. Voilà. Alors, je termine juste pour vous dire que je n'ai pu vous présenter aujourd'hui, je le regrette, qu'une typologie très, très abrégée des procédés de ce que j'ai appelé la littérarité documentaire. Je n'ai pu aborder le sujet des types documentaires dans lesquels on trouve ces procédés, ni surtout des fonctions qui sont assignées à ces littérarismes, on va dire. Alors c'est un sujet complexe qui m'aurait mené beaucoup trop loin dans la mesure où il combine une multitude de paramètres, des modes culturels, des fonctions de genre documentaire, des rapports sociaux et institutionnels, des problèmes aussi de psychologie et de profil culturel de celui qui écrit. J'espère pouvoir faire ça pour la version écrite. Voilà, je m'arrête là et je vous remercie de votre attention. Merci.
Allora, ringrazio il professor Fournet per questa interessantissima relazione, sulla quale credo che ci sarà anche spazio per la discussione. Se, Laura, la prevediamo adesso la discussione, anche perché mi pare che siamo in anticipo rispetto ai tempi, cosa che insomma è rara per merito dei relatori e anche un po' del Presidente, ma comunque siamo in anticipo e abbiamo del tempo per discutere, che è prezioso e che è il meglio. Quindi includiamo ovviamente nella discussione anche la relazione introduttiva di Laura, che però insomma era ricchissima di spunti che credo possano essere oggetto di domande e di approfondimenti, e poi ovviamente la relazione del professor Fournet, che ripeto a me personalmente è interessato moltissimo, ma lascio prima la parola a chi voglia intervenire sulle 2 relazioni, sia su quella di Laura sia su quella di Fournet. Nell'ordine o comunque in ordine sparso, direi che possiamo anche non rispettare necessariamente l'ordine dei 2 relatori, insomma.
Se non volete fare le domande in francese potete usare l'italiano. Non so se sono in grado di rispondere, ma...
Posso fare una domanda?
Bene.
Colgo l'occasione per rompere il ghiaccio, perché dietro questa relazione, Jean-Luc, dietro le cose che ci hai illustrato, spiegato, aleggia un po', no? Un fantasma che è quello forse della scuola. cioè questi individui che con così tanta duttilità utilizzano Omero e non solo, lo fanno per tante ragioni naturalmente, però forse anche perché hanno un qualche tipo di formazione in questa direzione, immagino. E ti volevo chiedere qualcosa su questo.
En français pour être plus rapide, parce que sinon, si je le fais en italien, je vais être trop long. Ça fait partie des fonctions que je voulais. Oui, mais je crois qu'on peut m'entendre. Ça fait partie des fonctions. Pour la, oui. Ça fait partie des fonctions. Pourquoi les gens avaient recours à ces mots poétiques, à ces citations, etc. Il y a plusieurs raisons. Il y a montrer sa culture, qui est quelque chose d'important, et en même temps qu'on montre sa culture, on essaye aussi d'être au niveau de celui à qui on s'adresse. Et ce n'est pas pour rien si ce type de littérarisation des textes documentaires est un phénomène relativement tardif, il se développe en même temps aussi que dans la société se développent des rapports de sociabilité qui font que lorsqu'on s'adresse à une autorité, on doit en même temps s'humilier et en même temps faire honneur à la personne à qui on s'adresse. C'est-à-dire les rapports deviennent beaucoup plus hiérarchiques et beaucoup plus... Et du coup, il faut le montrer au niveau de la langue. Et il faut faire honneur à la personne à qui on s'adresse. Et donc, on va rédiger des documents pour être au niveau de la personne à qui on s'adresse. Mais il y a beaucoup d'autres raisons. Il y a tout simplement le fait qu'on a étudié à l'école Homère et que quelquefois, il y a des homérismes qui sont presque naturels. Surtout, n'oubliez pas que nous avons affaire à des gens qui ne sont pas des Grecs. Ce ne sont pas des Grecs, ce sont des Égyptiens qui ont appris le grec. Ils n'ont pas le rapport à la langue grecque qui est celui d'un Grec en Grèce. C'est-à-dire qu'en fait, leur rapport au grec n'est pas un rapport aussi naturel. Et du coup, ils ne ressentent pas forcément les différenciations stylistiques de la même façon. C'est-à-dire qu'en fait, j'en arrive presque à une conclusion. À la fois, je dirais que cette littérarisation des documents montre un désir de montrer sa culture et d'honorer celui à qui on s'adresse, mais il est aussi d'une certaine façon la preuve presque dans certains cas, surtout quand on a affaire à des poétismes qui n'ont aucune fonction dans les textes documentaires, ils sont la preuve de personnes qui ont presque une déficience dans la façon de ressentir les niveaux stylistiques. Donc c'est pas toujours facile d'arriver à évaluer ce phénomène, parce que ça peut être un phénomène qui montre un désir de promouvoir la culture, mais c'est aussi un phénomène qui montre que cette culture n'était pas toujours ressentie, n'était pas toujours maîtrisée correctement. Voilà. Et c'est le cas avec Dioscore. Je pense que Dioscore avait trop lu Homère, et dans certains cas, on voit qu'il fait des homérismes volontaires, intentionnels, mais dans d'autres cas, il va utiliser par exemple autocasignetos, fratello, dans un petit document de rien du tout, où ce mot n'apporte absolument rien. Il n'a pas besoin de louer la personne à qui il s'adresse, il s'agit d'un contrat. Et donc là, on a l'impression presque d'une erreur stylistique. Ça lui a échappé, tellement il est imprégné d'Homère. Voilà. Donc c'est un phénomène extrêmement complexe qu'il faut évaluer sous différents angles. Voilà.
Grazie Jean-Luc per questa bellissima presentazione. Je pense à la chose à l'envers. Tu hai già fatto molte considerazioni su Dioscoro nei tuoi lavori, su quanto, e questo succede in ogni epoca, il linguaggio invece dei documenti che accompagnano la nostra vita giornaliera, tutti i giorni noi siamo pieni di documenti, e quanto invece, per Dioscoro, ma lo si può fare per tutti, il linguaggio documentario invece invada la letteratura. per esempio noi diciamo visto e considerato, io visto e considerato lo trovo in Pasolini, lo trovo in Calvino, nella letteratura italiana. Ecco, questa osmosi quasi, quindi è bello quello che tu hai fatto, cioè vederlo dal lato della letteratura che entra nel documento, e penso l'autre face de ça, cioè quelque chose qui rentre, qui part des documents qui font partie de notre vie et qui rentre dans la vie, dans la langage littéraire de l'autre côté. C'est autre chose, ce que je dis, mais c'est pareil, ce sont des choses au même niveau qui rentrent l'un dans l'autre.
Mais effectivement, il y a le phénomène de littérarisation du document, mais il y a le phénomène contraire, qui est le phénomène de la documentarisation de la littérature. Et on le voit avec, par exemple, la lettre. La lettre est devenue, dans l'Antiquité tardive, une façon de faire de la littérature, beaucoup plus qu'à des époques plus anciennes. Alors je sais bien qu'il y a des lettres à l'époque classique ou hellénistique, il y avait déjà des recueils de lettres qui pouvaient circuler. Mais la lettre est vraiment devenue disons, un genre littéraire, surtout dans l'Antiquité tardive, où chaque grand auteur, chaque père de l'Église, chaque personnage a écrit des lettres en sachant pertinemment que ces lettres allaient devenir de la littérature. Donc il y a aussi cette documentarisation de la littérature, si je puis dire. C'est-à-dire que c'est un phénomène. Les deux domaines sont allés l'un vers l'autre et se sont rencontrés.
So thank you, Jean-Luc. Very inspiring paper that you gave. I'm sure you have seen more documents than the ones that you presented us with these features, and I would like to ask you whether we can say something about the sociology of this class of writers who use all these features that you showed us and taxonomized.
Most of them are. Most of them are, of course, they are not peasants, or they have a certain social level. But there are some disparities, but in general, they belong to the upper class. Yes.
It seems that lawyers
are. Lawyers, yes, a lot of lawyers, but also. Have you seen some members of the boulot type, of the senatorial class, etc.? Yeah, but also there is a deacon, a priest. But people who mastered writing, who had a good command of Greek, of course, and of the graphical conventions. Maria?
Thank you. It was very inspiring. Just to continue, I think it's not only the writers, but you have to think about who is the reader and the audience, and they have to know their Homer and Euripides as well, so that's very important.
But have you seen the major part of the quotations, poetisms, etc., are in two types of documents: letters and petitions. Petitions, you address, you submit the petition to a high authority, so someone higher than you, and a letter is a letter that you send to someone of your circle, of your sphere. So the use of these literary procédés, how would you say, devices. Means equality, social equality, or when you address to someone higher than you are.
Una precisazione a proposito dell'uso di questo agraulusi melonomois nel papiro cairense, dove credo che si debba pensare come memoria poetica più che a Omero e a nonno a Esiodo, perché i poimenes agrauloi sono citati come tali nella Teogonia di Esiodo al verso 28, e poco prima si dice che Esiodo è mela nemonta. Quindi credo che qui agisca soprattutto una memoria esiodea più che omerica, certo, chiaramente anche Omero e nonno, ma qui è chiarissima la memoria esiodea, più forte delle altre. Quanto poi a l'uso, lo stranissimo composto tiumoleonta ftoros, no? E lì si capisce come ci sia anche una certa confusione linguistica nella ricezione di alcuni composti che vengono ovviamente dalla tradizione poetica come tiumoleonta da una parte, ma anche i composti col doppio accento come leontofonos, leontofonos, per cui spostando l'accento si porta l'attenzione sulla parte attiva dell'azione. E qui sembrerebbe esserci una memoria complessa di tutta una serie di epiteti poetici in cui appunto agisce oltretutto anche questa problematica accentuale dell'accento sulla prima parte del composto o sulla seconda. Mi sembrano due elementi che potrebbero, insomma, come dire, completare il quadro.
No, grazie molto, è interessante. La prima, ovviamente Esiodo è dietro, ma il problema è che non sappiamo se Dioscoro aveva una conoscenza diretta di Esiodo. Sappiamo che conosceva bene Omero per molte ragioni, e la prima è che abbiamo trovato nella giara in cui era il suo archivio un codice dell'Iliade e un altro codice di Scoglia ad Iliadem, e sappiamo bene che conosceva direttamente Nono. Il resto... E allora per ricostruire questo quadro dobbiamo anche tenere in conto, prendere in conto le conoscenze che quello che scriveva aveva della letteratura greca. Sono delle conoscenze molto... Sì.
Interventi. Chiudiamo questa prima parte, questa prima sessione. Adesso abbiamo una pausa, ci prendiamo un caffè nel corridoio e poi apriremo la seconda parte, la seconda sessione. Grazie a tutti e due i relatori.
Bene, penso che siamo pronti adesso per iniziare questa seconda parte, la seconda parte di questa sessione, prima sessione del nostro convegno, e sono molto contenta di presentare Klaas Bentijn oggi, che è sicuramente una persona perfetta per questo convegno, perché i suoi interessi, prima di tutto è professore associato all'Università di Ghent, e i suoi interessi vanno su due versanti, che sono proprio i due versanti di cui si occupa questo convegno. Da un lato la linguistica, con attenzione in particolare alla morfosintassi del greco antico e anche a tutti quelli che sono gli aspetti storici e sociali dell'indagine linguistica, e dall'altra parte il versante della papirologia. È molto noto come principal investigator del progetto ERC Starting Grant Everyday Writing in Greco-Roman and Late Antique Egypt, a Social Semiotic Study of Communicative Variation, in cui l'analisi linguistica dei documenti su papiro
è ampliata attraverso la considerazione delle componenti materiali e della visualità dei papiri in una prospettiva sociolinguistica. Non starò a elencare tutte le sue pubblicazioni, ma mi fa piacere sicuramente ricordare il suo volume del 2016, Verbal Periphrases in Ancient Greek, Have and Be Constructions, e una curatela, un volume miscellaneo curato insieme a Yasmina Mori, Novel Perspectives on Communication Practices in Antiquity Towards a Historical Social Semiotic Approach. E oggi ci parlerà di Documentary Papyri and the Literary Lexicon, e non rubo altro tempo, gli lascio subito la parola.
Hello everyone. You'll have to forgive me for speaking in English. I hope everything is clear, but if it is not, please feel free to ask me questions. So what will I be talking about today? I'll be talking about the lexicon, lexical variation in post-classical Greek. I'll start by a brief state of the art, and then see if we can develop a digital perspective towards that question. Also looking at some concrete examples, as Jean-Luc has already done so well. You see the concrete examples on the handout. And then I'll end by looking back and forward. It's all work in progress. Okay, lexical variation post-classical Greek. I think most of us know that this intensified in the post-classical period, among others due to ongoing phonological and morphological changes, with also cultural and religious influences prompting borrowing and semantic shift. It's a little ironic that the ancient Atticist grammarians were very attentive to lexical variation, whereas modern-day scholarship has paid so much less attention to lexical variation. In linguistics, lex is not really on the table. Papyrological scholarship has made observations about lexical usage, but not so much in an isolated fashion, typically in editions. I like this comment by Brashear, for example, about the Athenodoros archive. Striking in the otherwise banal wording of these everyday letters written by small people concerning their petty concerns is the occasional neologism or solitary attempt at sesquipedalian phraseology. But that's it then. State of the art, an important study is that by Raffaele Luiselli, who published the first systematic study on higher register Greek, focusing specifically on Atticism and poetic lexis. Jean-Luc has also cited Raffaele Luiselli. In that study, he shows many things, but also that higher register can be considered intentional and dependent on factors like the context, the audience, and the purpose. Also showing that writers do vary in competence and success. Not everyone is as good at this game. Some have a good, coherent, elevated style. Others show what Luiselli calls ambition outstripping ability. That's a euphemism. And all of this is linked to schooling. That's the first important study. Another recent study along similar lines is appearing in a volume edited by myself and Maria, which is due to appear soon, in which Katerina Koroli and Amphilochios Papatomas likewise show that private letters are not uniform and that they show conscious stylistic elevation. They establish a typology of what they call higher register features that includes rare vocabulary, abstract nouns, rhetorical figures, allusions to literary texts. One of their examples is a reference to Bacchylides. They also look at the social context in which these phenomena occur, paying particular attention to how these features might support, for example, the interactional goals of people engaging in requests. Like Luiselli, these authors also note that even high-style letters mix more refined elements with vernacular structures, and therefore they argue for a so-called register continuum rather than strict categories. Well, the next is Jean-Luc with his studies. I won't say too much about this because we've just heard Jean-Luc speak for 40 minutes or 30. There's a couple of very important things about Jean-Luc's work. One thing is that he looks at it from a diachronic angle, looking at how epistolary and other documentary forms change over time in reflection of broader shifts in education, administration, and self-presentation, with particular attention to the 4th and the 6th century. And then a second important aspect is the fact that Jean-Luc also looks at visual and material culture, so he looks at things from a multimodal perspective, paying attention to the use of accents, breathings, layout, and so on, things that people had not really considered, things that are borrowed from book culture and that people could use to display their paideia. The Ascos of Aphrodite is a particular case study in Jean-Luc's work, among others the homorizing diction that is used as part of Dioscos' self-fashioning. I'll also mention two studies of my own. One is on how lexis is used in different genres. The genres that I looked at were Atticist, lexica, documentary petitions that were rewritten, and then likewise hagiographical narrative that was rewritten. And the intention of the study was to look at how people react with regard to different linguistic levels. Are they more attentive to lexis than they are to syntax or spelling? And that is indeed the case, and I argued that that is because lexical choice is more socially visible, whereas syntactic structures are more abstract and harder to control. However, rather than viewing lexis and syntax as binary oppositions, I think, or I argued in that study, that it's better to think of a so-called constructional continuum, positing different types of linguistic features on a continuum. And then a second, more recent study is about what is happening in the Greek epistolary frame, which has traditionally been considered very standardized. But I tried to see if the variations that we see could be typologized, and that is indeed the case. There are indeed predictable ways of how writers adjust their epistolary frame. They're listed here. And what is interesting is that people can use these types of variation to engage in identity work. You could call them extravagant usages, even if some of them are quite common. People can use them to index different types of stance and relationship, like affection, respect, distance, deference, and so on. The types of social meanings that are indicated in this way, I think, are best considered fluid, context-dependent, and interactually negotiated. They're not established once and for all. So that was a brief state of the art, a presentation of studies that are all qualitative in nature, that don't use quantitative corpus-based methods. And the question that I want to ask today is whether we can also look at it from a digital perspective. And I'll first engage in what I call a macroscopic view, just looking at things from a helicopter perspective. We're very much aided in the effort by new open access corpora that combine papyri and literary texts like Glauks, published by Alec Keersmakers in Leuven, which has 20 million tokens, and then Opera Greca ad notata, which is more recent and has 40 million tokens. You could say that all of this is part of the rise of ancient language processing as a field of natural language processing. Just to put things in perspective, Glauks has 20 million, OGA has 40 million, TLG has 125 million, but then GPT-3 has 300 billion, and the most recent models have a couple of trillion tokens. So we're talking big data about classics. Anyway, we can use these corpora to immediately get an insight into the lexical usage in papyri. This figure shows how much is unique to the papyri and how much is shared with literary works. You see that especially adjectives, verbs, and nouns have unique usages. This is a list of the 50 most shared words. It won't surprise you that they are typically function words. Perhaps more interesting is unique words in the papyri, like indiction, prosdiagrapho, mecher, nobion. All of us who read and work with papyri will know these words. Of course, the question that I'm asking today is a bit different because we want to know about shared vocabulary, vocabulary that is literary in nature and that is used for sociolinguistic purposes. So how can we define that? And I think an obvious answer to that question would be to focus on terms that occur infrequently in the papyrological corpus that also occur in the literary corpus. There is a problem though, and that problem is known as Zipf's law, which says that, well, actually almost all of the words in a language typically occur infrequently. You have a couple of words that occur very frequently, then some that occur a bit less frequently, but then practically all of them at the right end of that curve occur infrequently. So that is a problem. If you look at the distribution for papyri, the blue line is the ideal line, and the dots, the black dots, are the actual usages. Then you see sort of a Zipfian curve with some items occurring very frequently, but then most of them occurring very infrequently. This is what the tail looks like, which you see especially at the end, words becoming very infrequent. And we can even look at that for each part of speech independently. And you see that the lines on the right represent nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, which have a high frequency, of which there are many, but typically also with a very low frequency of occurrence. So all of that is a bit problematic for our initial digital approach, which is why I think a second method is necessary, or complementary method, that is filtering. What can we do? Well, we can contrast frequency rates that we know for literary text with those that we have for non-literary text, so that if a term occurs in literary text and it has at least some frequency, so it doesn't have a frequency of 1 or 2, and it also occurs in non-literary text, you might say it could constitute a literary reference. Just to avoid anachronism, I focus specifically on classical literary texts and a couple of genres, but you could easily extend the exercise to post-classical Greek. It just becomes more complicated because you can't compare non-literary papyri to later literary text. And working in this way, I found around 1,300 literary terms that, or terms that potentially could be literary. These are some of the terms. They look quite literary at first sight, at least, like space, okun, polemios, atar, timos, and so on. It becomes really interesting when we map that to different types of metadata. Here is a curve of literary usages, and then we see what Jean-Luc was telling us before the break, that something is happening in the 4th to the 6th century when you have a sudden peak. We can also look at what is happening for each individual genre. And I know the lines are a bit messy, but at the bottom we have all the different types of contracts, whereas the upper lines represent letters, petitions, some types of contracts. And in this way, you can really map what is happening for each individual genre. We can also look at archives, and then it won't come as a surprise either that Dioscorus is top of the list. Some other well-known archives, Aurelius Ammon, the Boulé of Hermopolis, Theophanes archive, all come on top of the list. And then we can also look at parts of speech. Of that list of 1,300 potential literary terms, how many are of which part of speech? And we see that most of them actually come from the classes adjective, noun, and verb. but that adverbs are best represented with 8%, or relatively at least. That was the macroscopic point of view. We can discuss during the Q&A. Equally as interesting is the microscopic point of view, looking at what is happening in actual text. And for that purpose, I just briefly want to introduce the Everyday Writing Project, which was already mentioned. It's a project that ran for 6 years at Ghent University, in which we studied everyday documents with particular attention to what we then called communicative variation, just variation that we see across texts and that might be strategically employed. The project combined linguistic analysis with close analysis of visual material features, and we did that with a multi-layer digital database that allowed us to engage in a new, what we call social semiotic approach to ancient writing, and you can check some of the references at the back of the handout for that. Before we look at the text, it's important that I tell you about 2 key communication processes which I derived from this brilliant book by the late anthropologist Michael Silverstein, in which he distinguishes between what he calls entextualization, which is a term that you can use to refer to the process by which a discourse becomes an actual text, how a discourse is physically formed, and then contextualization, which is a rather different process because it refers to how context is built up gradually between discourse interactants, how an interactional and interpretive frame is formed. Contextualization is something that involves the intersubjective positioning of participants, and that is largely done through what anthropologists call indexical features. So these are features that have some function, but that also carry social meaning with them. And you can group these in paradigm sets of alternatives. Entextualization and contextualization represent sort of the 2 main analytical perspectives that we maintained in the Everett project, because we were interested in the architecture of genres, their entextualization, but at the same time also at the choices that were made within each of those pre-made building blocks. A model that I developed in 2023 to study entextualization from a multimodal point of view is shown here, where I distinguish between 3 levels of analysis. I call them micro, meso, and macro. And I distinguish between language and typography, or what you could call materiality or visual aspects. So you can do that for the clause and the sentence as a linguistic unit, or the line, and then for thematic and layout units, and at the highest level for generic and layout parts, or for the text in its entirety and the page. A model of contextualization is harder to come up with, but I think this one does a pretty good job. It's called the stance triangle, and it shows 2 subjects, subject 1 and 2, aligning with each other, but then also evaluating a 3rd object, which in our case could be the written object or what is represented in that written object, and positioning themselves with respect to that object. I classified all the terms that were relevant, all the potential literary terms that were relevant for the everyday writing corpus, but I won't go into that in detail here just because we don't have that much time, but just to show you, so various adjectives came up, especially evaluative adjectives, but then also nouns, both abstract nouns like atomia, eidos, aikia, but also concrete nouns, among others for artifacts, body parts, natural environment terms, and so on. And then a lot of verbs which you can classify in different classes, as well as different types of adverbs. And you have to apologize me for not going through each class in detail, but I think it's better if you just have a look at a couple of concrete instances on the handout. You can also put these in groups but I also skipped that. I also encountered some false positives. About 3% of all the supposed literary terms were wrong. Here are the examples, like kykloten, supposedly deriving from kyklo, or komes from komos, exekonta, which should be hexekonta, and therefore deriving from execo, exisio, which should have had a space on papyrus.info, supposedly deriving from exiso, or echtersin, not having an editorial regularization, deriving from echtos, supposedly. So if you use these digital data sets, that is something that you have to take into account. They're not perfect. Let's have a look at the examples. I just have to make sure I'm not over time. How much time do I have?
You still have 10 minutes.
Ah, okay.
10 minutes.
Yep. So my first example is this petition from Aurelius Serapius to the prefect, asking that her brother be appointed as guardian of her daughter as her husband has deceased. What does this text look like from an end-textualization point of view? Well, you have an ample margin at the bottom, which is quite noticeable. A small prescript at the top. It's not very elaborated. At the measure level, you have some use of spaces here and there. And at the macro level, at the level of the individual line, we see some things like seemingly enlarged letters at the beginning of each line and then line fillers at the end. You can also look at it from a linguistic point of view. There's not that much to note. There's a standard opening and closing formula. Measure level is more interesting because it's a really densely packed text. There's only a little thematic break at line 7 with un, hyper, un, and all the rest is really one big block with, at the micro level, a significant use of subordination, increasing clausal integration. One can note also some corrections and additions above the line. That's end-textualization, but what does contextualization look like? Well, I'd say that a couple of words are contributing to lexical contextualization, like hiketeria, which is quite infrequent in the papyrological corpus, but can be found in various classical and post-classical writers. Also, kata dees, needy, which is very infrequent in the papyrological corpus, but again can be found in various literary writers. And oikeiotes, a relationship which has no other papyrological instances. What is going on here? Well, you might say that what you can call relational vocabulary is strategically being used to frame the social act in a certain way. It's called a hiketeria, not a biblidion. It's something serious, even if it's just an appointment for a guardian, and to portray the key participants relating to that social act. So the daughter is needy, and the brother is a perfect family member. What else is going on lexically? Well, we have a standard form of address and then some other typical petition words like katafengo or phanos, nepios, which sort of form part of the rhetoric of petition writing. Also some variation and periphrases. And this is supported by morphology like the use of the dual and the optative and a good attention to orthography. That's the first example, but there's many more. This one won't come as a surprise. Jean-Luc, you also mentioned the archive. This is from the Theophanes archive, 4th century, a P. Herm papyrus. You can see that it has a very nice layout in terms of textualization, ample margins, also big gaps. So the measure level is a bit difficult to evaluate, but we can note the use of aspiration, typically for subordinate clause markers, which might have some function, I'm not sure. At the level of language, we have a standard opening formula, but then a very noticeably reformulated closing formula. You can see it on page 2. Eudaimonies di holu kyrie mu kai teoi doien hossasoi prosphile. This is Anatolios, the chief prophet, writing to Serapion in very noticeable language. At the measure level, he pays good attention to thematic shifts with discourse markers, and also has a lot of subordination and coordination going on, as you would expect in one of these P-Herm papyri. Lexical contextualization, a lot going on, as in P-Herm, which one was it, John? Look, P-Herm 4 or 6, I think. Like Axiagastos, only instance in the papyri, but then also Protumeomai, Aparaitetos, which is Anatolius' favorite word. He uses it 3 times in somewhat different contexts. Eudaimoneo, also quite rare. Then Prosphiles, well disposed. You see a lot of Plato and Plutarch popping up. Jean-Luc already said that we might have some identity work going on here, someone profiling himself as part of this circle of theophanies. In general, you could also say that a lot of evaluative vocabulary is used to sort of increase intersubjective alignment between the two writers. Anatolios is excusing himself for not seeing the addressee earlier in person. This is actually supported by various things like specific forms of address, formulaic variation, and other religious vocabulary like treskea, hieromenia, komasia, and so on, as well as by morphology and archaising syntax. Shall I do one more? Yeah. Well, I brought 4, but I'm not sure if I'll get to do all 3 or 4. This one is also quite noticeable for people working on this period. You'll probably know that it comes from the archive of Basil the Patriarch. It's an early Arabic papyrus, very noticeable because of its very long and narrow shape. It doesn't have the classical opening and closing, but it's much more noticeable at the meso level, where these papyri have plenty of lectional signs like apostrophes and high dots. Also noticeable at the micro level is these very balanced lines with a lot of space between them. If we study contextualization at the linguistic level, again, the prescript and the closing don't play a very important role, but at the meso level we have a lot going on with various discourse markers, and then at the micro level we see a lot of coordination and subordination happening again. Lexical contextualization, what does it look like? Well, we have things like kata dechomai, fren, which is rare in the papyri, but of course is found in classical and post-classical writers. And then a lot of terms that also occur in the Septuagint and the New Testament, like skandalon, kalopoieo, which is the only occurrence in papyri here, exaleipho, agonizomai. So how does lexis contribute to contextualization? You might say that volitional or psychological vocabulary with a poetic and religious background is being used to frame the social act in a certain way. It's something grave. Kura is writing to Basil to make up for arrears in taxes, so that's quite important. And he also wants him to come to headquarters. So the text is being portrayed as something very serious, and perhaps some social distance is being created between the key participants. This is also supported by various religious references, modifying adverbs that stress the importance of the matter. You also find something that you wouldn't necessarily expect in an official text like this, like these archaizing or classicizing discourse particles and particle combinations like umen alakai, which seem to contribute to the seriousness of the matter at hand. What is very interesting at the lexical level and also a bit perplexing is that we have these very uncommon phrases like katalabe tapros hemos, to say come down to us, or the use of diasu with the meaning from you. And then we also have many terms that don't occur anywhere else in papyri or literary texts, like extraordinarios, that should be miliaricios, pistoforeo, onomatizo, catagraphos or catagraphon, raidiugos, and chaotis, perhaps my favorite word, ameleti, aparaletos. So you have different lexical registers combined. Perhaps I'll skip this one because I do have some conclusions that I want to share. It's also a very interesting text about a husband whose wife has left him and he wants her to come back. And there seems to be some strategic vocabulary being used there as well. Particularly emotional vocabulary like pentos, kleio, penteo, salevo, which seems to be a sort of strategic use to characterize his emotions and to try to realign with the addressee. Okay, I'll skip this. Looking back and forward, also important. Yes, there are exciting new ways of mapping vocabulary, though we need to be careful about how we define what counts as literary vocabulary, and that's where in-depth qualitative study comes at play. From a social semiotic point of view, I'd say that it's worth not looking just at things in terms of register, low or high, but looking at stylization. How do people combine things to make their point? Important in that regard is what you can call intersemiotic complementarity. So how do language and materiality combine, or you can also call it stylistic balance if you prefer. One thing that has struck many scholars is that orthography seems to have been less of an issue. People combine high lexical language with orthographic misrepresentations. Might that be connected to the role of scribes? Perhaps. Now, in order to really comprehend what is going on, I think we need to start building lexical paradigms. For example, if someone says hikateria, what are the alternatives? Why hikateria, not biblidion, axiosis, deersis, all of that? That can be done in a digital way, and people are working on that as well. Equally important, I think, is paying close attention to the social cultural environment in which written communication took place, understanding which literary and metalinguistic texts sort of form the frame of reference. And then I think we also need to start looking at other text types apart from letters and petitions. As a concluding slide, I had a long list of things that are limitations. I won't go through all of them. The method that I employed and showed you today is quite crude. It's something that is at the start, not at the end. One thing that I want to emphasize to conclude is the last line, that the way that we have currently integrated these literary terms in the Everett project is quite static, because you just see them on a page, but you can't do anything with it, which is why I couldn't resist to try to build a little app myself to see if we can do better. An app where you can see for every term in every text, what is the background, in which papyrus text types does it occur, in which archives, and in which literary authors and literary genres does it occur, so that you can immediately get a picture of what is going on for each word in each text. Another way of looking at things is just searching for one specific lemma and then trying to build up, or two or three, and then trying to build up a network between documentary and literary texts, just to see if we can better understand the textual landscape in which individual lemmas are found. So in which papyri do they occur? You see them there. But then also which literary texts form the frame of reference, or which literary genres, if you like. And there's many, many applications, of course. One interesting application is seeing if we can map documentary text to each other based on the vocabulary that they use. You can set on the slider there dilemmas that you want to exclude. You don't want to see CAJs, for example, but you do want to see interesting terms that don't occur too frequently, to see how texts within and across archives map to each other. Here are some of the lemmas on the basis of which these texts here are mapped. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this exciting presentation. I have some questions, but I would like to leave the floor to other people who want to ask questions, if there are any. Ci sono domande?
I would like to thank you for this very interesting presentation. I'm very interested in this meso-level definition, because I think that it's crucial in your interpretation. I mean, in this social level, you find strong link with the socio-cultural environment. Probably the meso level is the key level for your discourse, and I'm wondering how the meso level in your interpretation can be linked with the paratextual characteristics of the papyri, and because in literary, in literary papyrology as well as documentary papyrology, the paratextual aspects are quite interesting, and if we can interpret them as part of this meso-level discourse, it can be useful to reconstruct a possible socio-cultural and broader environment. I don't know if I'm clear, but...
This way? Oh no, you're actually quite right that meso-level is really interesting, because people have always had the linguistic tools to organize their message. These discourse markers, or just prepositional phrases, whatever. But as Jean-Luc has also shown, increasingly they also have the visual means to organize their text. So this is where all the paratextual stuff is happening. And it's really interesting to see how the two combine together, because people can now leave some of the discourse markers and use paralinguistic or paratextual means instead. So how that combines is super interesting. And it's also the topic of a study of mine with Focalin Kodstra that we just published in Segno and Testo, where we look at, for the Cura archive, for the Cura dossier, how that comes together and at which points people put these visual breaks. But it's something that hasn't been done a lot for documentary text, and where a lot more could be done. Also, if you want to look at standardization processes, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was incredibly interesting. My point is, I have a problem with the digital approach. It is, I mean, the results are very interesting, but what do you do with the semantic literary words? I mean, the words, the poetisms. So I gave an example with skopos. Skopos is a prosaic word. It means the scope, the objective, but it can also have a literary meaning, the protector, guardian, etc. But these kind of words are completely invisible in the digital approach, because how do you do the difference between Scopus guardian and Scopus objective? And what is interesting is the literary meaning, not you understand what I mean. So it's a problem. How do you do?
Maybe I should have gone through the list, but points 2 and 3 are one of the limitations is that this digital approach is form-based. It's not meaning-based, so you can't really model semantic shifts, which plenty of them are going on in the post-classical period. I remember one of my examples on the list was eidolon, which also semantically changes in the post-classical period. People also for papyri are increasingly using digital methods to study semantics, because if you know if you can model for each word all the words which it co-occurs with, you can in principle also model its semantics. So people can use these methods to model semantics, and in principle you could then also model it to model semantic literary usages. So it's not impossible, but I didn't get to it for this paper. But Anne Keersmankers and other people are doing this for papyri as well, modeling semantics digitally, so that you can model synonyms, take into account semantics, and this is happening really, really rapidly. So it's not impossible, but not for this paper. Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Okay, thank you really for this presentation, fascinating and inspiring. I have many questions out of ignorance, but just I limit to one. It's extremely interesting, your graph about the literary lemmas, and it strikes me that at some point it overlaps eventual graphs about extant books. So you have more books in the 3rd century and you have more literary words in the 3rd century, less book in the 2nd century. Of course, there are different factors involved. But at some point there is a spike during the imperial age, and then the graph diverges, and not for just reasons of extant books, but because something is happening in society at that point. So that's something interesting, that you can have some parallels with extant material, so to say, remnants of language, and at some other points there are divergences. So my question is, did you try to shift from the linguistic sphere to the historical sphere, and to link the socio-linguistic changes that you record through your reconstructions to actual political changes in the history of Egypt? For example, during the Roman age, is it possible, in your view, to do something like that? Do you have any hints from your approach to this? Because, for example, for books, we could say something about that, also about the overall written evidence we have, but especially for books, for example. What about your corpus? Did you try to...
That's this point. Social cultural environment and understanding what forms the textual landscape, the reference point is super important, I think. And it would be really interesting, since we have that data for excellent books, to map those graphs to each other and to see if there's some correspondence. But in all honesty, I did not get there. I do think it's really important to also ask this question and not just do the digital modeling, because we really need to understand what is going on and not just have these lists, right? This is one, yeah.
Think about this, because sociocultural is a broad category.
Mm-hmm.
I mean also historical, so meaning
yeah.
political history,
yeah.
not just sociocultural,
yeah.
which is broader,
No, you're right.
category, but about that. So do you see some shift linked to some key factor in the history, for example? Did you try to figure if...
Well, we can, right now I just showed you the graph for these different periods with the peak and the late antique period, which is also what Jean-Luc was talking about earlier. But in principle, you could model it for each individual century or even smaller scale periods, and you could do that for each individual subgenre, so that you could start to study in very, very fine-grained detail what tendencies we are seeing and what is going on. But that's way beyond the scope of this paper, I'm sorry to say. Yeah, but I think it might be a very interesting direction for the future.
I also had a question that is somehow linked to what Laura was asking in the beginning. So I was wondering about the entextualization, and especially if it is possible for you to identify a relationship between the visual and the linguistic entextualization. So if it is possible to draw some general conclusions from your work on that.
Well, it's work that we've just started doing, but for example, for the Cura dossier, we do see that when people use, say, lipon or un, that typically tends to co-occur with certain visual markers or with bigger facets. So that it's interesting to start to compare the semantic weight that individual discourse markers have, ones that signal bigger versus smaller breaks, and to correlate that with different types of visual markers and to see how they combine. But again, it's really just starting now. Yeah.
Okay. It would be also interesting to understand if you can find something, like something more careful when there are more literary references or not. So this could also be interesting. So if the scribe is more careful, more interested in using that type of approach, when I don't know, just a question. Okay, thank you so much again. Grazie. E passiamo a questo punto alla seconda relazione, è l'ultima relazione della giornata, e continuiamo, direi, sulla scia delle incarnazioni perfette dei motivi e delle riflessioni che ci sono dietro questo convegno. Mi fa piacere introdurre Maria Vierros, che è professoressa di filologia classica presso l'Università di Helsinki, e anche in questo caso abbiamo una studiosa che coniuga nei suoi interessi di ricerca l'attenzione al dato linguistico, soprattutto nella forma della variazione linguistica, del bilinguismo, dei contatti tra lingue diverse, e l'indagine delle fonti papirologiche in lingua greca. Questi interessi si sono coniugati con un'applicazione costante delle risorse digitali, e questo emerge molto chiaramente dal progetto ERC Starting Grant Digital Grammar of Greek Documentary Papyri, di cui è stata principal investigator. Tra le sue moltissime pubblicazioni possiamo ricordare per esempio Bilingual Notaries in Hellenistic Egypt, Study of Greek as a Second Language del 2012, ma anche The Greek of the Petra Papyri del 2018 in un volume miscellaneo, e ancora con Henriksson Papy Greek Tree Banks, a dataset of linguistically annotated Greek documentary papyri, che è estremamente importante per la presentazione di questo dataset, questo database di papiri documentari corredati da annotazioni morfosintattiche. E oggi ci parlerà di Linguistic and Stylistic Analysis on Greek Documentary Papyri, Questions on Scalability.
I'll try not to breathe too much into it. Good evening, everyone, and I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and this will be very nice 2 days based on the 2 papers we already heard, which were very, very interesting and fascinating. And I hope I'm not disappointing you with this last paper. I have had a long day. So it's more like sort of questions and talking about scalability and methodological issues. So this is the outline of today. So first I'll briefly, I try to be brief, introducing some developments of linguistic analysis on papyrological data, because the title was Linguistic and Stylistic Analysis. So we can say a lot more nowadays about the linguistic analysis than what was the case like 20 years ago. And then go on questions on style, although we already heard quite a lot on sort of lexical literary style, which was very interesting, but I'm taking a bit sort of broader idea how to think from the point of view of documentary papyri, because that's what I've been working with, but then also thinking about a little bit of how we can think style in general, also with also literary materials. So are we talking about text type kind of style? And I think basically style, by style we mean somehow broadly variation. Then going to personal style and what's sort of the fingerprint of one person's language. And then I'm sort of talking about this via one case study that I have done before. Then go more to the questions on scalability and comparability with case study number 2, and then summing up. Right, so first the introduction, and apologies to those who have heard the project Papy Greek presented too many times, but I think that there are people who haven't, so I'm going through it quite fast. But first thinking about how papyrological sources have been used in understanding the evolution of Greek language. So there was a long century of sort of traditional methods producing grammars of Greek papyri, and then quite late 20th century and early 21st century, we have seen the rise and boost in electronic resources, and now we are in a totally different place than we were, for example, in 2006, so 20 years ago, when Trevor Evans, for example, organized the conference in Oxford, and then this Language of the Papyri book came out. There is one of the articles is sort of one of the first attempts using digital corpora for papyri. So after that, there's been several initiatives, and some of them have been already mentioned today. And papyri.info data is basically behind all of them. So all the TEI Epidoc XML documents are basic at the base and core thing, and then we have tried in different projects deal with them in different ways, and we have heard classes talk already where several of these projects were mentioned, and I will then just say a few words about the Papy Greek project. So we have built during the project the platform where we have the grammar being built on documentary papyri. We have annotated text, so morphosyntactic annotation that was already mentioned. We have the tree banks also available, and there's a search tool, and we can either search for orthographic variation or morphological variation, or we can search syntax, and sort of there is the original layer and regularized layer taken into account, so what's in the papyrus and what is not. But you can read the details in, for example, this paper mentioned below. So also we have there on the online platform sort of a bit different visualization of the papyri without the brackets if somebody wants that, but you can also then see the word information there. And this is more important for what I will be presenting as this case study. So we have added some metadata on our texts concerning the people who were involved in the language production, so either the authors or the writers. This is not. So we gave our own ID numbers for the people involved in the text we were annotating, and also, of course, linking them with the Trismegistos ID. And here, what we mean by author is the person who is somehow in charge of producing the text. So, for example, the letter sender. The writer is the person who is actually performing the writing. And these two roles may overlap, or we can mark the overlap as uncertain. So we are not sure if this is the owned hand by Philocles, for example. So sometimes we are not sure, and this information is based on what the editors have given us on the handwriting, and we are trusting those people. We are not really looking at the materials like Class's project is looking at the actual papyrus. We are sort of just focusing on the language. And then we have the so the syntactic annotation concerns only small part of the papyrus, but for the whole Duke Data Bank of Documentary Papyri, we have the morphological analysis made by neural networks and language models trained with lots of tree banks and other materials. So you can see, if you make a query, you can see also when you have manual annotation information for the part of speech tag, for example, or then the algorithm also gives a sort of confidence score here. The algorithm is quite certain that this is feminine, plural feminine dative here. So, going to stylistic features. So basically, when we are talking about documentary papyri, do we have genres? What kind of text type-based variation do we see? What is related? Do we have petition style? Do we have? Whoa! I already forgot that I should be still. And we already heard about lexical strategies in many, even in petitions and letters. So also other possible rhetorical, highly elevated linguistic elements obviously are there. But is this then contributing the style of the author? Is it the style of the social class we were already discussing? And these are very interesting questions. But when we are looking at the documentary text, also the sort of personal variation is interesting, and how do we get into the personal level, and what is sort of the fingerprint of one person's style? I mean, it's not only the lexical features that they use. Klaas was mentioning the syntax, and this is very interesting to look at if the syntax can be used as a feature that we can look at the styles in more sort of on the macro scale, I would say. But this is the issue that I have been interested in from the beginning. So who is actually in charge of the language that we are reading in documentary papyri? Because we have the scribal officials, the writers, and then we also have the authors, who is not necessarily the same person. And to go into that, we can look at stylometric studies. Stylometry has been done for over centuries, well, a couple of centuries, in traditional methods, but then sort of more digital approaches have been used with authorship attribution. So looking at if we have text that we don't know who has been written it, we can look at the language, and via certain features we can say that is this written by Cicero or not, for example. So with literary text we actually can do this with computational methods. But what kind of features are those that we can look at when we are looking at the personal style? So I'm using as case study here the study that has been long in the making, but we finally published it last year. So looking at a set of documentary papyri and look if we can actually, when we know already who is the author, so if we can test those methods that have been used for short texts like documentary papyri, and can we find stylistic clusters and features that actually tell us about the writer, the author, and their style. So there were two kind of different tasks, profiling the authors in a way that we cluster the documents based on the language itself, so the computer doesn't know, even if we know already the actual authors. And then there's the attribution task, and sort of looking at if the algorithm can detect who was actually writing the text when certain amount of training data is given to it. So looking at what kind of textual features work with these methods, and do they work with short texts like papyri? That was the main question there. So the old stylometry used in traditional studies contain features like looking at what kind of words, how long sentences, how long texts, what kind of sort of things that can be more easily counted. But now with papyri we can have different features like orthographic variation, the morphological forms, and then I'll go through of those later on in more detail. So this is the technical slide. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. but basically there was something. Okay, the table should not be touched. About the frequency issues with the zip, what was it called? Zip flow. And then there basically we need to, for machine learning, we need to vectorize the text, and then sort of looking at the term frequency and then inverse document frequency in also exactly because of sort of normalizing this document length and how what is frequent in one place it's a different thing if it's a longer text and so on. And then using sort of k-means clustering for these groupings was in the clustering thing. But we trained our algorithms with lots of data. This was actually done before we had the opera greca ad notata materials, but we have used other. So we have used literary text and papyri. So, but the features, the ones here in bold were the ones that we were actually using, but we could have used other features as well. But the character n-grams was quite important. So it's just very technical, looking at dividing words into shorter sequences of letters, and then looking at what is the frequency of these, and basically because machines have so much computing power, this tells both about the lexicon in a way, and then it tells about many other issues in language, also the case uses, preposition uses, whatever, because it's only sort of looking at the short sections and how they are repetitive in certain texts. Then in stylometry, often function words are very important, because this is something that does not bear semantics in them so much. So they are used quite unconsciously by speakers and writers. So this would tell about the personal individual style quite easily. So this is all actually used in forensics, in court, to if you are sort of looking at who has been behind some text or utterance. And this is topic independent. So here we don't need to be thinking that, okay, the issue that they are talking about is somehow taking the style in one direction, because function words are quite semantically free. Of course, they are not really semantically free, but it's a thing, sort of, there's lots of discussion on where do we draw the line. Is function, the prepositions, pronouns, particles. Greek is great for function words because it has so many particles, but then, of course, prepositions and pronouns do bear semantics, but they are still used in a different way. And then we were looking at part of speech and making bi and diagrams of them as well. And then, since we are talking about papyri, the orthographic variations can be one interesting feature. So we had these test cases in this study. They are all from the Hellenistic period, so they are not so far apart in time, which I think was good for this study, so that the chronological difference doesn't play a role here. For the Xenon Archive 2 people, for Papyrus Archives 3 notaries, and from the UPZ Katokoe Archive, these 2 authors. So when we were using the clustering thing, this is based on just character n-grams. So the important thing to look at in this plot is the shape of the dot that represents one document. So all the triangles are sort of, the algorithm thinks that they are clustered as one group, and all the crosses and all the circles. And the color is actually then the author that we have marked in the database. So basically now we want to see if the colors match the shape of the dot, and also how close they are in this plot, because closeness means that they are similar in a way, but then the shape tells if the algorithm sort of puts them in the same cluster, so thinks that they are actually similar in their language. And what happened here was that actually not the authors actually cluster, but basically more the text type. So this is, the algorithm detects the style of the text type, the genre, and somewhat also the authors, because in some of them, some of the groupings, they are close. But this was not based on any other linguistic feature than just the character n-grams. So I think this was quite interesting result. And we added the function words, thinking that it probably tells more. And yes, this is different. It looks different, and it's sort of more, it gives, there is more fits in the shape and the colors, but not totally. So there are still differences. Different authors among the same shape, but like in the top part there is the red author is dominant, and it's all the circles there. But of course, so we had lots of these nice figures, and then we could make deductions on these. And then we could look them also in three-dimensional form, and this is, and then just taking one archive, and so there's only 2 writers here from the Xenon archive, and here we have n-grams where the gram is 7, and here we see more clearly the that the algorithm actually did detect one writer in one cluster and the other, and sorry, I used the wrong word, not writer, but author. And the author classification worked really well, so the prediction for the writers that this is aligned from the corner to corner is very good, and the percentages are very well, almost 100% every part. Some mismatches, but not very much. But of course, we only had 5 writers here. They are quite different from different archives and so on. And what was the interesting result was, of course, that the n-grams were actually enough. When we added here, the function words did not make better result. But when you look at it in more detail, there are some things that can be different. So for the methodological considerations, for the case study of the articular infinitive that will be in this book that Klaas mentioned, they promised in the press that they will publish it still this year. So we could look at when the infinitive is nominalized, that, well, many issues there. Looking at the large corpus of papyri Duke NLP compared to our smaller corpus, Papy Greek, both are saying 6% are articular, so this is good for both corpora. But it's interesting that in this study I compared with literary corpus that was also annotated. There we have more articular infinitive than in papyri, but the New Testament has even more. So there are, that is telling quite something. And then we can look, for example, the prepositions governing the articular infinitive. Dia is, of course, the highest, and in papyri. But then again, in the New Testament, dia was not among the 3 best prepositions governing the articular infinitive. So there are many things that then we want to go and look in more detail when we make this sort of large-scale study. And here are the different writers divided from the literary corpus. So there are differences between different writers. So we do detect stylistic differences there. We can look at also tense, and there are also differences in papyri, in New Testament, in the literature. So always when we are doing this, we easily get lost sort of with using the corpora. We always need to bear in mind the size and the chronological scope of the corpora. Are the syntactic parsing methods reliable? So when you're doing manual annotation compared to automatic, there might be differences. And then if you have a feature that is very rare, if it doesn't exist in your smaller corpus, what do you do then? There are these issues of scalability there, but when you are comparing different corpora, you need to be quite sort of careful when you are doing your interpretations. But using several different corpora, this is always an asset info, of course. But you always need to know how the data has been produced. So for some discussion, we saw that documents can be grouped, for example, based on stylistic features with the help of algorithms, but then what are the features precisely? That remains unknown because the algorithm always is sort of a black box. And then you need to, you can go and look at the results in more details, but then that always takes more time, of course. And then what are the features specific to certain text types or individual authors? You need to have different methods finding out that. But then always when we are talking about this, like they are stylistic differences, we should always be defining what we mean by style, because it's a different thing. It's a very wide semantic field for the word style. And then so we have computational quantitative methods, and the general appearance of these methods is that, okay, there's scalability, there's comparability, which is great, and there is. They do tell us about general trends and developments, but then we always need to sort of be aware of possible glitches and potholes there because of possible problems with corpus production, possible wrongly made queries, for example, because you need to think how the query can give you everything you need, or how many false positives you have there, and then think how to interpret that. So traditional methods may seem more trustworthy somehow, but then there are other problems with replicability and small size and subjectivity. So I think we need both. But what we need mostly is more open, reliable, documented data. Grazie mille.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I learned a lot of things. I'm kind of an intruder in this session, so I learned a lot. Are there any questions? I have one just to start with. I was wondering about the author identification you were talking about. And you also said something about the genre and the typology of document in that specific research and identification. I was wondering how that can impact the results of the identification of the author. So the style of one author could change or not, depending on the text typology that author is writing at that specific time. I don't know if my question is clear enough.
Well, it might be that my presentation was not clear enough in a way that, of course, I was looking at some literary authors and then also comparing the documentary papyri. So it's very different way of looking at genre, I think, in literary text and in papyri. But what was interesting in the literary corpus, because it was based on one person's annotations of literary prose authors, and there, for example, it was quite interesting to see that Aristotle was very high up in using the articular infinitive, for example, but when you look at it, the corpus, it's only one work of Aristotle, so you would need more annotations from Aristotle. But I'm not quite sure I'm answering what you were asking, but there are many different levels at play, I would say.
Other questions?
So thank you, Maria. I was trying to think about the way you define style, or you understand style, was different than the way style is defined in two previous papers. So I was kind of thinking about complementarity and you know, getting different angles. It seems to me that your viewpoint, your angle on the text would give better results on or insights on genre rather than and on author and personal style when we really have clusters of documents like archives, like the example you gave with the 3 archives, and not that good results perhaps when we just give all the letters from Oxyrhynchus. What would you, have I misunderstood?
Well, it would be very interesting to see what would happen with all the letters from Oxyrhynchus. how they would cluster together. So this is not, we didn't get that far yet. But I would say, so my point of view was quite sort of taking the linguistic elements as the features and not so much choosing, for example, lexicon or something like that. And I would say that does tell you about the personal style of, even though if you are not looking only like function words, but you are looking at character engrams, it sort of gives you the individual style. I'm quite sort of sure of it because the clusters, even though it seemed like they are mostly giving you the text types, there is still so much similarity in the notarial text, but then when you added, for example, the function words, it did give you the notaries, even though all the different notaries were writing very similar documents, but sort of the differences that there are, the linguistic idiosyncrasies somehow probably play a role when the algorithm still finds actually this one writer forming one group. So but it needs fine-tuning and looking into more. So this was sort of preliminary thing, testing the methods. Who was there?
Well, I have two questions. The first was also about the n-gram, so maybe we should skip it. But I was just wondering if n-grams are so good at genre classification, whether we shouldn't just use them for that task, because that's not something that is undisputed either, genre and subgenre classification, and see how it matches with traditional genre classifications. If it's so good at that, might be worth testing. But the other question was about the articular infinitive study. If you could share any thoughts about scalability and reproducibility there in terms of syntactic analysis across literary and non-literary corpora. Is it a method that you would recommend others to follow, or was it surprisingly difficult exercise? No. You did it for one, so. No.
Yeah, I think that was in that for the papyri I mostly used the Duke NLP, so the automatically parsed corpus produced by Alekkar's makers for the papyri. And then, because in all of them we need the tree banks to see where the actual article is depending on. And there actually the problem I see is that it was the automatically parsed one, and I'm not sure that all of those were correctly, that the article is always on the correct word. So that was, but to which direction it is actually going. But this is why I think it was good that the percentage was the same also in our manually annotated version and in the automatically annotated version. But there are so many different points in direction where you can look at scalability as well in that study. But I think it was still worth doing. I think produces interesting insights for this feature.
I think we should probably close up. Dobbiamo chiudere, a meno che non ci sia una piccola domanda, un'ultima breve domanda. Ok, allora...
Okay, just not to lose much time. Just by ignorance and I don't know if I followed everything about the Zenon archive. You considered it as a whole archive, not dividing the three phases it is made up. So you consider all the texts of the Zenon archive together. What do you focus on just to...
No, from the Zenon archive we had a selection of works annotated, and for this study we took only the authors that we had most tokens from. So we always selected the authors that have had the most tokens. So most words, yeah.
Because it's different when he works for example, in Alexandria, is in strict contact with Alexandria, or where he's just doing his own private business in Fayoum. That's my question.
Now I cannot remember at the moment, sorry.
Va bene, a questo punto direi che possiamo veramente chiudere. Ringraziamo di nuovo i relatori del nostro pomeriggio, della giornata, e riprendiamo, ci vediamo domani. Grazie a tutti.
Sì, ci vediamo domani alle 10. Volevo ringraziare tutte le persone che hanno partecipato a questa giornata, a questo pomeriggio, e salutare anche le persone che ci hanno seguito online. A domani.